had been looking forward to the weekend all month. The idea was simple. Escape the city, find a cabin tucked deep in the forest, and spend 2 days alone, away from noise and people. I had chosen a small cabin I found listed online, far enough from any town that I wouldn't hear car engines or the faint hum of electricity from nearby homes. The photos were sparse but promising. A modest wooden structure, a stone fireplace, a small porch overlooking a clearing with a creek running along one side. The owner promised complete privacy. That had been enough for me. The drive was long, nearly 5 hours through winding roads, dense woods, and stretches of highway that seemed to go on forever. I left early on Friday morning, trying to beat any traffic. The city faded behind me as I passed through towns that felt almost deserted, gas stations with hand-painted signs, and diners where only a few cars were parked outside. By the time I turned onto the gravel road that led to the cabin, I was fully immersed in forest. The trees were tall, old pines and oaks, their roots pushing through the soil in unnatural twists. The road narrowed and became rutted with potholes, making me drive slowly, careful not to tear a tire. The cabin came into view in a small clearing. It was exactly as the pictures had promised. Wooden, sturdy, and silent. The porch sagged slightly on one side, but not alarmingly, and the chimney was clean. There were no other buildings in sight. I parked, got out, and took a long look around. The forest pressed close on all sides, shadows stretching even in the late afternoon sun. I felt a rush of excitement mixed with the tiniest thread of unease. The inside of the cabin smelled like wood and dust. I had brought food, water, and a backpack with clothes and supplies. There was a small stack of firewood, enough to last a couple of nights, and a box of matches. The fireplace was large, made of gray stone, with blackened marks from past fires. The furniture was sparse. A table with a couple of chairs, a small sofa, and a single bed in the corner of the main room. There was a small bathroom with a shower and a sink. Water came from a well, which I tested immediately. It was cold, clear, and safe to drink. I unpacked my things, setting my bag on the floor, organizing the food and supplies. By the time I finished, the sun was starting to drop, casting a golden light through the windows. I lit a fire in the fireplace and sat in the chair closest to it, listening to the crackle of flames. Outside, the wind moved through the trees, rustling leaves and snapping small branches. It was a pleasant sound at first, almost like music. But then, as darkness settled, the forest changed. The sound of the wind intensified, mixing with the occasional snap of a branch, the rustle of something moving in the underbrush. I reminded myself that this was normal. The forest was alive. Animals moved at night. I cooked a simple dinner, just canned beans and bread, and ate slowly, savoring the quiet. Afterward, I washed up in the small sink, feeling the chill from the evening air seeping through the thin walls of the cabin. I lit another log in the fireplace to keep the room warm. The shadows danced on the walls, stretching and shrinking as the firelight flickered. Sitting there, I felt completely alone. First, it was peaceful, but as the night deepened, a creeping anxiety began to build. Around midnight, I heard something, a low, dragging sound outside, like metal scraping over stone, but muffled by distance. I froze, listening. The wind had dropped, leaving the sound clearer. It came from somewhere near the back of the cabin, where the forest was thickest. I told myself it was probably an animal, maybe a deer caught in a fence, or branches scraping against rocks. But the sound repeated, slow, deliberate, moving closer. I could hear a faint crunching of leaves, the careful placement of weight. I tried to convince myself it was nothing. I was rational. I had been alone in the woods before, hiking and camping, but this was different. This was not a campsite. There were no other people for miles. The nearest cabin visible on the map was at least 3 kilometers away. My mind raced through possibilities, each one making my stomach turn. I grabbed the small flashlight I had brought and edged toward the window. Peering outside, the light cut through the darkness, revealing the forest floor. Branches and leaves glimmered in the beam, but there was nothing else. The sound stopped. I let out a shaky breath, telling myself I was imagining it. I returned to my chair, trying to focus on the fire, but sleep would not come. Every crack of the wood, every shifting of the wind through the trees, made me tense. Around 2 in the morning, I heard it again, louder this time. Footsteps, slow, heavy, approaching the cabin. My first thought was to call someone, but there was no signal. I had checked before I left. My phone showed no bars, not even emergency service. Panic set in. I felt trapped, completely exposed. I thought about locking the doors, but the main door had a simple latch. It would delay someone determined, but it wasn't enough. I moved quietly to the kitchen. There was a small knife in a drawer, not much, but it was something. I held it in my hand, trying to feel some sense of control. The footsteps continued, circling the cabin, stopping at times as if whoever or whatever was out there was listening. The dragging sound returned, and then a soft thump against the back wall. My heart was hammering. I crouched in the shadows, trying to make myself invisible, gripping the knife tightly. Hours passed. The noises came and went. I did not dare sleep. The fire burned low, and I had to feed it more wood just to keep some light. I thought about leaving, but stepping outside in the dark seemed too dangerous. Whoever was out there would see me immediately, and I had no idea if they were armed or not. I considered climbing through the window and running into the trees, but the terrain was uneven, filled with rocks and roots. I would likely stumble and fall before I got a safe distance. As the night dragged on, the forest remained alive with sounds. Twigs snapping, leaves rustling, occasional thumps. I stayed crouched, alert, barely breathing. I tried to remind myself of rational explanations. Maybe a bear, though they usually avoided humans. Maybe a hunter, though I had not seen any signs. Still, the noises had patterns that suggested awareness. Whoever or whatever it was, it seemed to be observing, learning, testing. Dawn came slowly. The darkness lifted, revealing the cabin surrounded by dense forest. Exhausted and trembling, I peeked out the window. There were tracks around the cabin, deep impressions in the soft soil. They were too large for a deer, too irregular for any normal animal. I could see broken branches where something had brushed against trees, moved carefully. The thought hit me, it had been a person. Someone had spent hours circling my cabin in the night, watching, perhaps waiting for me to show myself. I spent the day fortifying the cabin. I pushed furniture against the doors and windows, barricading the main entrance as best I could. I retrieved my backpack and checked the supplies. There was food for 1 more day, water for 2. I rationed carefully, knowing I couldn't leave until nightfall, when light would mask my movement. I stayed inside, moving only when necessary, keeping the knife close. That night, I waited again. I heard the soft movements outside, but this time I was ready. When a shadow passed a window, I aimed the flashlight toward it. The figure froze, then moved away quickly. I realized it had been trying to see inside. I stayed alert all night. Fire kept burning, and every sound kept me on edge. By morning, the person or people had gone. Tracks disappeared into the forest. I waited until mid-morning, then cautiously stepped outside. The clearing was empty, no one in sight. The forest seemed peaceful now, almost normal, but I knew the threat had been real. I packed my things quickly, leaving the cabin as it was, and returned to the gravel road. My car was there, just as I had left it. I drove back to civilization slowly, checking behind me repeatedly. The experience left me shaken, but it also left me with lessons. I realized how vulnerable one could be in isolation, how quickly a quiet, peaceful place could turn dangerous. I made notes for future trips. Always check for cell coverage, carry multiple ways to defend oneself, and never assume complete privacy. The cabin was safe in the sense that I left alive, unharmed physically, but the memory of that night stayed with me. I could still hear the rustle of leaves, the soft dragging sounds, and the deliberate footsteps circling my cabin. It became a story I would tell myself many times, not as a tale of horror, but as a reminder of reality. The woods are quiet but never completely safe, and people sometimes are more dangerous than any animal. I never went back to that cabin. I researched the area and found that others had reported strange noises, signs of trespass, or sightings of unknown people near the same cabin, though nothing official had ever come of it. I realized that for some, isolation isn't a retreat, it's an opportunity. The woods are an advantage to those who know how to use them, and a trap to those who don't. I kept this story private for years, telling it only to myself in quiet moments, always grateful that I had survived, that I had left with my mind intact and my body safe. Even now, years later, whenever I walk through a forest or park alone, I am hyper-aware of every sound, every movement, every shadow. I know what it feels like to be watched without knowing by whom. And I know that real fear doesn't come from myths or ghosts. It comes from other humans and the terrifying unpredictability of being alone in the world. I never expected a trip to a remote cabin in the mountains to turn into one of the scariest experiences of my life. It began as an ordinary weekend plan. I wanted to get away from the noise of the city, escape from the endless emails and phone calls, and just be alone with the woods. I found a small cabin online, tucked deep in a forested valley, far from any town or main road. The pictures were simple but inviting. A wooden cabin with a small porch surrounded by pine trees, with a creek running not far behind it. No electricity, no running water, just a basic wood stove and a propane heater. It promised quiet, peace, and solitude, exactly what I thought I wanted. I drove for hours on narrow, winding roads, the kind that force you to keep your hands tight on the wheel. The GPS stopped giving directions once I turned onto a dirt path that seemed to vanish into the trees. I had to slow down to barely more than a crawl because the road was uneven, with roots and rocks sticking up like hidden traps. The sun was already dipping low behind the mountains when I finally reached the cabin. The air smelled like wet pine needles and moss. A cold wind blew through the trees, rattling the roof and the windows. The cabin looked smaller in person than it had online, and its paint was weathered and peeling. But it was exactly what I wanted, isolated and quiet. I parked my car on a patch of flattened grass and got out. The air was cold and damp, even for late spring. I had packed some food, water, a flashlight, a small first aid kit, and a few blankets, thinking I'd be comfortable enough for a night or two. The cabin door creaked as I pushed it open. Inside, the smell of dust and old wood hit me immediately. Cobwebs clung to the corners of the ceiling. There was a small kitchen area with a sink that I assumed was non-functional, a tiny gas stove, and a few cabinets with some old pans. The main room had a small table and 2 chairs, a couch with worn cushions, and a wood stove in the corner. Upstairs was a loft with a narrow bed and a thin mattress. The windows were covered in dirt and spider webs, but I could see the dense forest outside. The first night was uneventful. I lit the wood stove, made some instant noodles, and watched the dark forest outside as the wind rustled the trees. First, it was calming. The quiet was heavy, almost like it pressed against your ears. There was no distant traffic, no airplanes, no other people. Just the wind, the occasional call of a bird, and the creek behind the cabin murmuring in the darkness. I felt like I had escaped the city completely, but the stillness that first night started to feel oppressive. Every sound became amplified, the snapping of twigs outside, the rustling of small animals through the underbrush. I found myself waking multiple times, thinking I heard someone walking just outside the door. I convinced myself it was animals, probably deer or raccoons, but I couldn't shake the feeling that someone could be watching the cabin. I went outside with a flashlight and scanned the surrounding trees, but nothing was there, just shadows that moved with the wind. I tried to laugh it off and went back inside, but sleep didn't come easily after that. The next morning, I decided to explore the area. There was a trail near the creek that led further into the forest. The air smelled fresher near the water, and the moss-covered stones made the path slippery. I walked for hours, enjoying the quiet and the way the sunlight broke through the thick canopy of trees. The forest seemed alive with the small movements of animals, but I didn't see anything larger than a squirrel or a few birds. I returned to the cabin as the sun was beginning to lower again, feeling tired but content. That night, the wind grew stronger. It rattled the windows so loudly that it felt like the walls themselves were shaking. I had brought a small battery-powered lantern, and I kept it on the table while I sat by the stove. Around midnight, I heard the first real sound that made my heart skip. A low, deliberate crunching of leaves outside, near the cabin. I froze, straining to hear through the storm of wind. The sound stopped, then started again, closer this time. Crunch, pause, crunch, pause. It wasn't random like deer or raccoons. It felt purposeful. Someone or something was moving slowly, deliberately around the cabin. I tried to rationalize it. Maybe a hiker lost in the woods, maybe someone camping nearby. But the cabin was isolated, and the closest road was miles away. My phone had no signal, so calling for help was impossible. I kept as quiet as possible, hiding near the stove, hoping the sound would pass. Didn't. Instead, I heard a soft tapping on the window facing the forest. My stomach dropped. I didn't move. The tapping continued for a few seconds, then stopped. My mind raced with possibilities, none of them good. I decided to check the perimeter with a flashlight, staying close to the walls. The beam cut through the darkness, illuminating the trees and the edge of the creek. The ground was soft from recent rain, and I could see footprints. They were large, heavy prints made by boots. They circled the cabin. I felt my hands shake as I realized someone had been walking around me, possibly watching me while I ate, while I slept. I retraced the prints and saw they led into the forest, disappearing into the shadows. The rest of the night passed in tense silence. I barely slept, sitting fully clothed on the couch with the flashlight in one hand and a large kitchen knife in the other. Every sound from outside made me jump, my heart hammering in my chest. I kept imagining someone stepping into the cabin, waiting for me to notice. Every little noise became a threat. The wind, the branches scraping, the creek gurgling. It all felt like a warning. The next day, I knew I had to leave, but leaving was more complicated than I had expected. The dirt road was slick with mud from the rain overnight, and the car might get stuck. I packed quickly, trying not to make noise, and checked the surroundings one last time. There was nothing visible, no one in sight, but the footprints from last night had not gone away. They were still clear in the mud near the cabin. Someone had been here very recently. I drove slowly down the dirt path, my eyes constantly scanning the trees, expecting to see someone following me. Every shadow seemed to move, every sound startled me. When I finally reached the main road and saw a few passing cars, relief washed over me. The tension in my body loosened. I called my friend from a nearby town, explaining where I had been, and they advised me to report it. I did, but there wasn't much the local authorities could do. The forest was vast, the cabin remote. By the time anyone could investigate, the footprints would have been washed away or hidden. I never went back to that cabin. I learned to research more carefully, to trust my instincts, and to be cautious when seeking solitude. The experience stayed with me not because of ghosts or monsters, but because of the very real fear of being watched, of being completely alone in a place where no help could reach me. I realized that nature itself can be peaceful, but isolation can amplify the smallest dangers into terror. I carry the memory of that night with me. The endless wind, the footprints around the cabin, the tapping on the window. It's a reminder of how thin the line is between solitude and danger when you are truly alone. Even months later, I can still picture the cabin in my mind. Its peeling paint, the dark forest surrounding it, the creek behind it, and the way the wind could make it feel alive with unseen eyes. It changed the way I see the wilderness. I still hike and camp, but I never again underestimate how quickly peace can turn into fear when someone else is out there, watching silently. That experience taught me to respect isolation, to prepare for it, and to understand that the most frightening things aren't always imagined. They can be very real. When I finally told the story to my friends, they couldn't understand why I didn't call someone or leave immediately. But the truth is, in that moment, panic isn't the first reaction. Your brain tries to make sense of the unknown. You rationalize, you hope it's nothing. Only later do you realize the real danger was not just being in the forest alone, but not knowing if someone else was out there, silently circling you, waiting. And that is a fear that stays with you long after you are safe. I eventually reported the cabin's location to local authorities, more as a precaution than anything else. They assured me the property was private and that trespassers were rare, but I knew better. Someone had been there, tracking my movements, and they could return. It wasn't a ghost, it wasn't a storybook monster. It was a person. Real, human, unpredictable, and capable of anything. That realization made me understand that the scariest situations are not the imagined ones. They are the ones grounded in reality, where danger exists and you are powerless to call for help. I never went back to that forest, and I never stayed in a cabin so remote again. I stick to places where I can at least see other people, where help is nearby, and where the isolation doesn't come with the risk of an unseen watcher. The memory of that weekend remains vivid. The smell of wet pine needles, the feel of mud under my boots, the sound of the creek, the wind rattling the windows, and most of all, the footsteps circling the cabin, leaving me awake and alert all night. It's a memory I carry not as a tale of horror, but as a lesson in caution, respect for isolation, and the unpredictable nature of other humans when you are truly alone. Started as a weekend getaway. I had been craving solitude for months, needing to escape the constant noise of the city, the endless demands at work, and the endless stream of people in my life. The idea was simple. Rent a small, isolated cabin deep in the woods, spend a few days alone, hike, read, and just breathe. The cabin wasn't fancy, just a rustic wooden structure built decades ago, tucked away in a valley between two hills, surrounded by thick forest. The owner had warned me it was remote, that cell service was spotty at best, but I liked the thought of being unreachable, if only for a short time. The drive out was long and uneventful. I watched the city fade behind me as the road narrowed, then became a gravel track that twisted through thick pine forests. The air changed too. It was cooler, fresher, and carried a scent I hadn't smelled in years. A mix of damp earth, pine needles, and decaying leaves. Birds chirped intermittently, and the occasional rustle of small animals in the underbrush reminded me that the woods were alive, even if I couldn't see much. By the time I reached the cabin, the sun was beginning to sink behind the hills, casting long shadows across the trees. The cabin itself was more worn than I expected. The wood had darkened with age, and the roof sagged slightly in one corner. A thin layer of dust covered the porch, and a stack of firewood leaned haphazardly against one wall. I parked my car nearby and carried my bags inside. Inside, the air smelled faintly of mildew, but not overwhelmingly so. The furniture was simple. A small table with 2 chairs, a bed with a faded quilt, a tiny kitchenette with basic supplies, and a wood stove in the corner. There was a lantern and a stack of firewood next to it, along with a few cans of beans and bottled water left by the owner. There was no electricity beyond a single dim bulb in the ceiling. The cabin had a window that faced the forest, and as I looked out, the shadows of the trees stretched across the clearing like long, dark fingers. The isolation was immediate and total. For the first time in months, I felt alone in the truest sense. I spent the first hour unpacking and organizing, setting up my sleeping area and making sure the stove worked. The fire started easily, the dry wood crackling and sending small sparks into the air. I felt a strange satisfaction in that sound, a primitive reassurance that warmth and light could be created by nothing more than human effort. I ate a simple meal, sitting by the fire, listening to the forest outside, and feeling a growing sense of contentment. The first night passed uneventfully, the darkness pressing in through the windows, the sounds of the woods unfamiliar but not threatening. The next day, I set out to explore. The forest around the cabin was dense, the trees tall and close together. The ground was uneven, covered in roots and fallen branches, and the air smelled strongly of moss and damp leaves. I followed a narrow trail that seemed to wind endlessly uphill, my boots crunching on the forest floor. The sun filtered through the canopy, creating shifting patterns of light and shadow. Birds called from unseen perches, and every now and then, a squirrel darted across my path. It felt peaceful at first, but as I climbed higher, I began to notice subtle signs that I wasn't alone in a way I expected. Footprints in the mud that weren't mine, Small broken branches that looked like they had been stepped on. Faint rustling sounds just beyond my vision. I brushed it off. The forest was alive, and I was just noticing it more than usual. By the time I returned to the cabin, the sky was overcast, heavy clouds pressing down on the forest. I started a fire in the stove again and sat close, feeling the warmth seep into my hands and face. Outside, the wind began to pick up, rattling the thin glass in the window. I checked my phone. No signal, as expected, and I made a mental note that I would have to rely on the map I had printed. The thought of being entirely cut off was slightly unnerving, but I reminded myself that I had chosen this solitude. That night, I slept fitfully. I kept waking at strange intervals, convinced I had heard something outside. A branch snapping, leaves rustling, and the occasional low thump that sounded like a footstep on the ground. I told myself it was the wind, animals, my imagination, anything but something human. The cabin groaned under the weight of the storm outside, and the fire flickered in the stove, casting dancing shadows across the walls. It was impossible to shake the feeling that I was being watched. The next morning, I decided to go further into the forest, determined to reclaim a sense of calm. I packed a small bag with water, snacks, and a flashlight, and left the cabin behind. The path soon became less defined, and I relied on instinct to guide me, following the rise of the hills and the flow of a small stream. The forest here was denser, older, almost oppressive. I noticed markings on trees, scratches that seemed deliberate, arranged in patterns I didn't understand. My stomach tightened, but I forced myself to keep moving, telling myself it was just a hunter or perhaps signs of animals. Deer antlers, maybe a bear trying to claw at the trees. Anything but a human presence. Hours passed. The sun dipped lower in the sky, filtered through thick clouds that now seemed ready to break. I realized I had wandered far, far from the cabin, farther than I had intended. I checked my map. I had misjudged the distance, and retracing my steps would take longer than I expected. I felt a creeping anxiety. The forest was quiet now in a way that was unnerving. Birds had stopped calling, and even the squirrels and smaller animals seemed to vanish. Every sound, a distant thump, a crack, the rustle of leaves, made my heart jump. The scratches on the trees seemed closer together now, almost forming lines, almost like someone had walked parallel to me. I tried to calm myself, told myself the forest played tricks, but a knot of dread had settled in my stomach. When I finally started heading back, the light was fading rapidly. Shadows stretched unnaturally, and the paths I had followed earlier seemed unfamiliar. Every turn seemed to lead me deeper into the forest rather than out of it. My pace quickened. I called out, quietly at first, then louder, but the forest swallowed my voice. I felt a rush of panic. I was alone. No one could hear me. No one could come. The thought was terrifying. Then I saw it. A figure, crouched behind a tree, partially hidden, watching me. At first, I thought it was a deer, but it didn't move naturally. My pulse spiked. I turned and ran, adrenaline surging, feet slipping on the damp leaves and mud. Branches tore at my clothes and scratched my skin, but I didn't care. The figure followed, staying at a distance, just enough to be noticed if I looked back. I didn't dare look. I just ran, trying to memorize landmarks, trying to remember the trail. The forest seemed endless, and the dark was falling faster than I could keep up. Hours later, soaked and exhausted, I stumbled into a small clearing I didn't recognize. A small stream ran through it, and I recognized a bend in the land that matched a spot on my map. Relief washed over me, but so did fear. Whoever or whatever was following me could still be out there. I crouched by the stream, drinking water and trying to calm my shaking hands. I listened, straining for sounds. Silence. Then a soft rustle from behind the trees. I froze. The figure was back, just at the edge of the clearing. Not moving, but definitely there. I considered running again, but I was too tired to move fast, too exposed to make it worth it. I remembered the survival tactics I had read about. I needed light, a fire, something to make me visible and intimidating. I gathered dry branches from the edges of the clearing, though the damp made them hard to ignite. Finally, after what felt like forever, a small flame caught. Smoke rose, a faint orange glow illuminated the area, and I felt a flicker of safety. The figure didn't approach. I stayed up there, tending the fire, and eventually the rustling stopped. Hours passed, the night stretching endlessly, but I refused to sleep. Sleep meant vulnerability, and I wasn't ready for that. By dawn, exhaustion was overwhelming. The figure hadn't returned, and I made my way slowly, carefully, back toward the cabin. I avoided the main paths, sticking close to streams and uneven terrain to avoid leaving a clear trail. Every crack of a branch, every ripple in the water, every shadow sent my heart racing, but I pushed forward. After what felt like an eternity, the familiar outline of the cabin appeared through the trees. Relief surged, almost collapsing me into tears. I ran the last few yards, burst through the door, and bolted it behind me. The fire in the stove had died overnight, leaving the room cold and gray, but it didn't matter. I was safe inside, and the woods couldn't reach me here. I didn't leave the cabin for the rest of the day. I cleaned up, reinforced the windows as best I could, and stocked firewood near the stove and the door. I set up a small barricade, nothing fancy, just enough to feel protected. I stayed alert, checking outside repeatedly, scanning the tree-line for any sign of movement. I didn't see anything, but I didn't sleep much either. The paranoia lingered, the feeling that eyes were always on me. It was exhausting, mentally and physically. But as the second night passed, I started to convince myself the figure was gone, that the first night's terror had been the culmination of anxiety, exhaustion, and my imagination. The next morning, I set out to leave. I packed quickly, determined not to linger. I followed the gravel path back to the main road, sticking to open areas as much as possible. Every crack and rustle made me tense, but I kept moving, focusing on the road ahead. Finally, after nearly a day of cautious walking, I reached a small town on the outskirts of the forest. I felt human again. People walked the streets, cars passed by, and for the first time in days, I could hear voices. I found a gas station, called the local police, and reported the incident. They took me seriously, sent officers to check the forest and surrounding trails, but by the time they arrived, no one had been found. I never returned to that cabin. The owner was sympathetic when I told him what happened, though he insisted the area had always been safe. Maybe it had, maybe my perception had amplified things. Maybe someone had been following me, maybe it was a hunter, maybe it was something worse. I'll never know. What I do know is that the forest is vast, isolating, and unpredictable. Even the simplest weekend getaway can become a fight for survival if you're not careful. If luck isn't on your side. I learned to respect the isolation, the silence, and the unseen watchers. And I learned that sometimes, being alone is not the same as being safe. I never thought a weekend in a remote cabin could feel so isolating. But as I drove the last few miles along the rough, gravel road, the dense forest pressing on either side of the vehicle, I realized I had underestimated how alone I would be. The cabin was tucked deep into the hills, far from any main roads or neighbors, and it had a rustic charm that appealed to me when I first booked it. Wooden logs, darkened by age and weather, and a stone chimney rising proudly from the roof made it seem like a place straight out of a hiking magazine. The forest around it was thick and wild, with pines stretching high and leaves covering the ground in a damp, earthy carpet. The sun was beginning to dip behind the trees, casting long shadows that slanted across the road, and a chill had begun to settle into the air. I parked my car next to the cabin and unloaded my bag, noticing the way the tires sank slightly into the soft ground. The cabin door was sturdy but showed signs of age, the wood warped slightly, and the metal handle worn smooth. Inside, the place was clean, surprisingly so, though it had a faint smell of damp wood and something earthy, like the forest had seeped in. There was a fireplace stacked with kindling, a small kitchen area with the essentials, and a few basic furnishings that looked serviceable but well used. I unpacked slowly, setting up my sleeping area in the corner of the main room, and then wandered outside to take in the forest. The silence was remarkable. There was no traffic, no distant hum of civilization, only the occasional rustle of leaves or a bird settling in the trees. Even the wind seemed muffled by the thick stands of trees around me. As the sun sank lower, I felt an odd mixture of calm and unease. Part of me wanted the solitude, but another part, deeper, cautious, told me that this kind of isolation carried risks I hadn't fully considered. I decided to light a fire in the fireplace to fend off the cold. The first sparks sputtered and hissed before catching the kindling, and soon a warm, orange glow filled the cabin. Shadows danced across the walls, flickering against the wooden beams and casting odd shapes that seemed to stretch and twist as the fire grew. I moved around to check the cabin more thoroughly. There were 2 doors leading to small rooms, a single bathroom with a basic toilet and shower, and windows that framed the dense forest outside. All seemed normal, but the further I explored, the more I became aware of just how alone I truly was. Night fell completely, and the forest outside turned into a solid black wall. The wind whispered through the pines, and every small sound, an animal scurrying across leaves, the creak of the cabin settling, felt magnified. I tried to distract myself by organizing my supplies and planning the next day's hike, but my mind kept wandering back to the idea that out here, no one could help me if something went wrong. That thought lingered, gnawing at the back of my mind, until I finally decided to check all the locks on the doors and windows. Everything seemed fine. The cabin was solid. Still, I couldn't shake the tension. The sense that being out here alone made me unusually vulnerable. The next morning, I woke early to the sun filtering through the trees. I had prepared a small breakfast and then packed my bag for a hike along a trail that led up a nearby ridge. The forest was dense, the trail narrow and winding, but the views at the top were said to be worth it. I moved carefully, watching every step, aware of how uneven the path was, how easy it would be to twist an ankle or fall. Partway up, I noticed signs of wildlife, broken branches, tracks in the mud, but nothing alarming. Still, there was a constant awareness in me that I was deep in territory where help would not come quickly. Hours passed as I hiked, moving slowly but steadily. When I finally reached the ridge, I paused to catch my breath and take in the view. The valley below was a tapestry of green, and the hills in the distance rose in layers, fading into a pale blue mist. It was beautiful, almost surreal, and yet there was something about the isolation that pressed in on me, a tangible weight. The forest felt alive in ways that were hard to describe. The wind shifting, shadows moving, the distant sound of running water or snapping branches. I stayed only briefly, taking photos and drinking water, before starting the careful descent. By mid-afternoon, clouds had begun to gather, and the light shifted, turning the forest from vibrant green to dull, muted tones. Rain began to fall lightly, and the trail became slick with mud. I moved cautiously, using my walking stick to test each step. That's when I noticed the first sign that something was not right. Faint footprints in the mud that were not mine. At first, I thought maybe they were from another hiker, but the prints were deep, heavy, and set in an unusual pattern, as if whoever or whatever had been moving there was large and deliberate. My heart rate picked up, but I told myself to stay calm. I was not far from the cabin, and it could simply be someone else hiking the same trail. The rain began to fall harder, and I pushed to make better time, my shoes slipping slightly on the wet ground. Then I heard it. A low rustle, heavy and deliberate, moving through the trees to my left. I froze, my stomach tightening. The sound was not a bird or small animal. It was too heavy, too close. I tried to move quietly, thinking I could backtrack to the cabin without attracting attention, but the sound followed me, keeping pace just beyond the trees. Panic began to creep in. I reminded myself that the forest is full of animals, and the most likely explanation was a deer or maybe a bear, but even saying it out loud didn't make the fear go away. I broke into a faster pace, slipping and sliding on the muddy trail, and soon the trees thinned enough that I could see the cabin in the distance. Relief surged through me, but it was tempered by the fact that I could still hear heavy, crunching steps following me. I didn't dare look back. I reached the cabin, slammed the door shut, and bolted it. I leaned against it, catching my breath, listening. The sounds outside slowed and then stopped, leaving only the rain and the wind. I tried to convince myself it was an animal that had lost interest. I was safe, at least for now. I spent the rest of the day preparing. I cleared brush away from the cabin's perimeter, made sure the firewood was stacked close, and set up a few improvised barriers by the doors. Sticks wedged under handles, rocks placed strategically. I checked the locks again and again, not trusting the metal or the wood to hold against something strong. The day dragged into night, and I could not sleep. Every sound outside, the creak of a branch, the snap of a twig, made my stomach tighten. I realized how unprepared I was for this kind of solitude, and how quickly fear could grip you when there is no one else around to reassure you. The next morning, I decided to hike cautiously to a nearby stream to refill my water supply, choosing a different route than the previous day. I stayed alert, constantly scanning the forest for movement. I noticed more tracks, heavier and deeper than before, leading in a vague direction toward the cabin. I stopped and studied them, realizing with growing anxiety that something had been moving around the cabin at night, something large enough to leave significant impressions in the soil. Fear made my pulse spike, but I forced myself to remain rational. Could be a bear or another large animal. Either way, I needed to be prepared. Back at the cabin, I reinforced the doors and windows as best as I could. I stacked firewood near the entrance, prepared extra torches, and made sure I had food and water easily accessible in case I needed to stay put. Hours passed slowly, the wind picking up outside and rain dripping from the eaves. The forest around the cabin seemed almost alive, the shadows moving with the wind, and the occasional distant sound, branches snapping, leaves rustling, kept me tense. I stayed near the fireplace, constantly checking the windows and doors. I felt my muscles tighten and my mind grow restless from the constant vigilance. That night, I heard the first direct sign that something had come close. A heavy thump echoed against the cabin wall, followed by a scrape along the wooden siding. My heart pounded so loudly I thought it might echo outside. I grabbed a long stick, ready to defend myself if necessary. The noises came sporadically, heavy, deliberate, almost testing the boundaries of the cabin. I stayed crouched near the fire, waiting, listening, never daring to sleep. Hours dragged by. By dawn, the forest fell silent again, and I realized I had survived the night. Over the next 2 days, I remained in the cabin, venturing out only briefly and always armed with my walking stick and a makeshift shield of sorts, a piece of scrap wood I had found outside. I noticed more signs of large animal activity. Deep prints around the perimeter, flattened grass where something had been lying in wait. I knew that if I tried to leave too quickly, I could provoke an encounter I was not ready for. Patience became my strategy, staying calm and waiting for an opportunity. Finally, on the 4th day, I spotted a ranger's truck driving along the main road that led to the cabin. Relief was overwhelming. I had survived without injury, without panic taking over completely, and now help was available. I waved as best as I could from the cabin window, and the ranger approached cautiously. They inspected the area, noted the tracks, and confirmed my fears. There had been a bear in the vicinity, moving around the cabin and possibly following my trail. I realized how close I had come to a real encounter. The ranger stayed long enough to ensure I was prepared for the next steps. They advised clearing a wider area around the cabin and leaving food out of reach to reduce the chance of another close encounter. I listened carefully, grateful for the guidance. When the ranger finally left, I took a long look at the forest, the cabin, and the trail I had traveled. I felt a deep respect for the wilderness, for its dangers, and for the fine line between thrill and peril. The remainder of my stay passed without incident. I kept the fire going, avoided hiking alone, and followed all precautions I had learned. By the end of the week, when I drove back along the gravel road, leaving the cabin behind, I felt a mixture of relief, exhaustion, and accomplishment. The experience had tested my patience, my fear management, and my awareness of the natural world. It had been terrifying, yes, but also illuminating. I had survived by being cautious, alert, and respectful of the environment, and that realization stayed with me long after I returned to civilization. I knew I would return one day, but not as recklessly as before. The cabin and the forest had taught me a lesson in vigilance, in preparedness, and in understanding the power of nature. I left it behind safely, but the memory of those nights, the rustle in the trees, and the pounding of my heart near the cabin walls remained vivid, a reminder of how fragile safety can be when faced with the untamed world. I had driven into the mountains just as the last sliver of sunlight faded behind the jagged peaks. The road had been narrow, steep, and winding, but the GPS insisted that the cabin I had rented was just another 10 minutes ahead. The forest around me had grown dense, pressing close to the edges of the road with towering pine and fir trees. Their branches stretched over the pavement like fingers, casting the road into shadow even before night had fully arrived. I could feel my pulse speed up, a subtle awareness that I was entering a place that time had largely forgotten. When I finally spotted the cabin, I had to stop the car to make sure it was real. It stood alone in a small clearing, made of rough-hewn logs, darkened with age and weather. The windows reflected nothing but the black of the forest, and the door was slightly warped, hanging unevenly on its hinges. There was a thin layer of dust and dirt on the porch boards, as though no one had stepped there for months, maybe years. I told myself it was normal for a remote rental, but the thought lingered uncomfortably. I stepped out of the car, the air immediately heavier and colder than I had expected. There was a damp, earthy smell, the scent of wet wood and pine needles. I pulled my jacket tighter and moved toward the cabin, dragging my suitcase over the uneven ground, feeling the weight of isolation settle around me. My phone barely had any signal. The GPS had been a joke. Once I left the main road, it kept recalculating, uncertain. That alone would have been a warning, but I shrugged it off. I had wanted solitude, and here I had it in abundance. The cabin door creaked loudly as I opened it, the sound echoing through the empty interior. Dust motes floated in the pale light of the fading sky coming through grimy windows. The main room was small, with a stone fireplace on one side and a few pieces of furniture, all covered in white sheets. The air smelled stale, like the cabin had been shut up for a long time. I set my suitcase down and started exploring slowly, taking in every detail. The floorboards groaned under my weight, uneven and warped. The walls were dark with age, the corners shadowed in ways that made my skin crawl slightly. I decided to light the fireplace. The cabin had a stack of wood in a corner, dry and brittle. It was slow going at first. The kindling refused to catch, but eventually the flames leapt to life. The warm orange glow filled the room, revealing more details. On the far wall, a large mirror reflected the flickering fire, but I noticed something odd. The reflection didn't quite match reality. A shadow seemed to linger just at the edge of the glass, something dark that didn't belong to me or the firelight. I blinked hard, convinced my eyes were playing tricks. When I looked again, it was gone. I set up a small cot in the corner and laid out my supplies, trying to push down the creeping unease. I told myself I was tired, that my imagination was making the shadows move. Outside, the wind began to pick up, rattling the old windows and whistling through the gaps in the logs. I could hear branches scratching against the cabin, and at one point, the sound of something heavy moving in the forest, a branch breaking or maybe an animal. I tried to ignore it, telling myself that I had come here for peace and solitude, and that fear was part of the price. Night fell fully, deep and absolute. The fire was low, embers glowing faintly, and I realized that I hadn't eaten or even unpacked fully. I sat on the edge of the cot, listening. There was a rhythmic thump, soft but deliberate, coming from the back of the cabin. My heart jumped, and I froze, straining to listen. It sounded like something heavy being dragged across the floor, though there was nothing in the cabin but my suitcase. I told myself it was an animal outside, maybe a deer brushing against the wall. But the sound persisted, steady, almost purposeful. I grabbed a flashlight from my bag and walked cautiously to the back of the cabin. The wooden floorboards creaked under me, each step sounding far too loud. I shone the light into the corners, scanning for movement. Nothing. The back door was locked from the inside, and the windows were shut. Still, the thumping continued, sometimes slowing, sometimes stopping, then starting again. I could feel sweat on my forehead. My mind raced, imagining someone had been here before me, someone hiding in the forest, or worse, had been inside the cabin recently and left without me knowing. Hours passed. I stayed near the fire, keeping the flashlight within reach, my ears straining for any sound. Outside, the wind became a howl, rattling the cabin and sending a few loose boards clattering. Every shadow felt alive. Every whisper of the wind sounded like footsteps on the porch. I tried to read my book, but I could barely focus. I kept looking at the door, at the windows, at every dark corner, expecting something to appear. Eventually, exhaustion won. I lay on the cot, fully dressed, flashlight clutched in my hand, ears open to every sound. I woke suddenly in the middle of the night to the sound of something moving very close to the cabin. Not outside, but right at the walls. Something scraping against the logs. My heart raced. I froze, listening. There was a long pause. Then the scraping started again. Slower this time, deliberate, measured. I realized with a jolt that the sound was too low for a deer or raccoon. Something large. Something alive. Someone, maybe. I knew I had to get out. But the nearest road was miles away, and in the darkness, I couldn't see a thing outside. My car was parked too far, and even if I reached it, I wouldn't have cell service. I grabbed a heavy flashlight and crept to the door, hand on the handle. The scraping stopped. Silence. I held my breath, then slowly opened the door a crack and looked out. Nothing but darkness. I stepped outside, the wind biting at my skin, branches scratching at my jacket. I started walking toward the car, keeping low and moving as quietly as possible. The forest seemed endless, every step crunching on fallen leaves and twigs. Behind me, I heard it again. A snapping branch, this time closer, right behind me. I ran. My lungs burned, my legs ached, but I kept moving, not daring to look back. By the time I reached the car, my hands were shaking. I fumbled with the keys, finally got the door open, and collapsed inside. The headlights cut through the darkness, and I drove slowly, every nerve on edge. I kept looking in the rearview mirror, half expecting to see someone following. But there was nothing, just trees, shadows, and the occasional glint of moonlight on leaves. I didn't stop until I reached a small town at the base of the mountain. The first place I found with people, lights, and phones. I called the authorities and reported the cabin and the strange sounds. They told me they would send someone to check it out, but I could tell from their tone that such calls were rare and that the cabin had a reputation among locals for being odd. No one admitted to knowing why. Days later, I returned with law enforcement. They searched the cabin thoroughly. There were signs that someone had been living there recently. Old food cans, a makeshift bed in the corner, and footprints in the dirt outside. No one had been inside the building at the time, but it was clear that someone had used it as a hideout. That explained the noises, the scraping, the movement. I realized I had narrowly avoided a potentially dangerous confrontation. After that, I never went back to the mountains. I had sought solitude, but I had learned a hard lesson. Isolation can be dangerous in ways no imagination can prepare you for. The memory of that night stayed with me, a reminder of how vulnerable a single person can be in the wilderness, and how important it is to respect the unknowns of a place, even if they seem calm and beautiful during the day. I also made it a point to always check the history of any remote cabin before staying. Not everything abandoned or quiet is safe. The experience changed me. I became more cautious, more aware, and more skeptical of the idea that I could ever fully be alone without risk. But it also taught me resilience. I had survived, kept my wits, and escaped a potentially dangerous encounter by staying calm and thinking ahead. That night in the cabin in the mountains would never leave me, not as a haunting memory, but as a stark, realistic lesson in vigilance, preparation, and the unpredictable nature of isolation. I never planned to end up in the situation I found myself in that weekend. Alone in a cabin deep in the mountains, surrounded by nothing but thick forest and the silence that comes with being far from the nearest town. It had started as a simple plan. Escape the city for a few days, find a quiet cabin to myself, breathe clean air, and let the stress of work fade. I found the listing online a week earlier, a small rustic cabin about an hour's drive from the nearest highway, accessible only by a dirt road that wound through the forest. The photos showed a cozy wooden structure with a stone fireplace, a small kitchen, and a loft bed. Perfect, I thought, for a few days of solitude. The drive there was longer than I expected. The road turned from asphalt to gravel, then to packed dirt, twisting around steep hills and through thick groves of trees. There were no signs of other cars, no streetlights, just the wind in the pines and the occasional sound of birds or small animals rustling through the underbrush. By the time I reached the cabin, the sun was low, casting long shadows across the clearing where the cabin stood. It was smaller in person than in the photos, but it had a charm that made it feel welcoming rather than cramped. The air smelled of pine and damp earth, fresh and heavy with the scent of the forest. I unloaded my car, carrying the bags up to the porch, and stepped inside. The floor creaked under my weight. The walls smelled faintly of wood polish and old smoke. The cabin was empty, silent except for the faint hum of the wind outside. I set my things down and walked around, inspecting it. There was a small kitchen with basic appliances, a table with 2 chairs, a couch in front of the fireplace, and a ladder leading up to the loft where the bed was. The windows were dusty but clear, and I could see the thick trees all around, a wall of green and brown that seemed to stretch forever. I turned on the lights, though they were dim, powered by the cabin's own generator, and unpacked a few essentials: food, water, and a first aid kit. I always carried one, even for short trips, a habit I had developed over the years from hiking and camping. That first evening, I stayed up later than I intended, sitting by the fireplace, reading a book and drinking a cup of coffee I had brought from home. Outside, the wind picked up, rattling the loose shutters and shaking the trees. It made the cabin feel small and fragile, like it could be swallowed by the forest if I wasn't careful. I went to bed early, thinking I would sleep well after the long drive, but sleep was slow to come. Every creak of the cabin, every rustle outside, seemed amplified in the silence. Eventually, I drifted off, but I woke several times, alert and uneasy, though I couldn't say why. The cabin was perfectly normal. There was no reason to feel scared. Still, the feeling persisted. The next morning, I woke to the sun streaming through the window, bright and warm, and the smell of wet leaves carried in through the open window. I had planned a hike that day, a short loop trail I had found marked on a map, starting just a mile from the cabin. I dressed in layers, packed a small backpack with water, snacks, and a flashlight, and locked the cabin behind me. The trail was beautiful, winding through tall pines and over small streams, and the air smelled of damp earth and moss. Birds called from the trees, and the sun filtered through the branches in golden beams. I felt a sense of peace as I walked, far removed from the noise and stress of the city. The hike was longer than I expected. The trail became steeper, the path narrowing as it wound higher into the hills. I found myself slipping on loose rocks and mud in places, careful with every step. After about 3 hours, I reached a small clearing at the top of a ridge with a view of the valley below. I sat on a rock, catching my breath, drinking water, and taking in the view. The silence was absolute, broken only by the occasional gust of wind. I stayed there for a while, feeling both exhilarated and isolated, before turning back toward the cabin. It was on the way back that I first noticed something odd. I was walking down a familiar section of the trail when I caught movement out of the corner of my eye. A figure, a man, standing among the trees watching me. He was partially obscured by the trunks and shadows, and I froze, unsure if I had imagined it. The man didn't move or make a sound, just stared. I slowed my pace, trying to seem casual, but my heart was pounding. When I looked again a few steps later, he was gone. I told myself it was probably another hiker, or someone I hadn't seen enter the trail, and that he had moved on. Still, an uneasy feeling settled in my stomach. By the time I returned to the cabin, the sky was turning gray, and the wind was picking up again. I locked the door behind me, checked the windows, and tried to shake the unease from earlier. I made a small dinner, watched the fire crackle in the fireplace, and tried to focus on something mundane, like organizing my supplies. But the feeling that I was being watched persisted, subtle at first, then stronger. I kept checking the windows, but I never saw anyone. The forest outside was dense, hiding anything that might be moving among the trees. That night, sleep was impossible. Every sound outside, the wind rattling the shutters, branches scraping against the roof, small animals scurrying, made me tense. I kept my phone and flashlight close, my mind racing through scenarios, thinking about how someone could approach the cabin unnoticed. The idea seemed unlikely, but the thought refused to leave me. I stayed up until dawn, dozing lightly, ears straining for any sign of movement. The next day, I decided to go into town. I needed supplies and a break from the isolation. I drove down the dirt road, careful of the steep turns and loose gravel, and reached the small town about 30 minutes away. It was tiny, a cluster of houses and a general store with a few locals milling about. I bought food, extra water, batteries, and some basic tools, and asked a couple of people casually about the forest trails and whether the area was safe. They nodded, mentioned occasional hunters, and warned about wildlife, but nothing seemed alarming. On the way back, I felt a little better, reassured that there were other people around. When I returned to the cabin, the feeling of unease was worse, not better. I parked the car, unloaded the supplies, and checked the cabin. Everything seemed in order, but there was something off. A few items I had left on the porch were moved slightly, as if someone had brushed past them. The locks were intact, the windows shut, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. I tried to rationalize it. Perhaps I had left things slightly out of place when I returned. But the thought lingered in the back of my mind, gnawing at my sense of security. That night, I set up a system. I put chairs against the doors, wedged objects to make noise if they moved, and kept a flashlight in my hand. I tried to sleep, but it was a light, uneasy sleep, broken by the occasional sound outside. At one point, I thought I heard footsteps approaching the cabin, slow, deliberate. I froze, straining to listen. The sound stopped, and I stayed still for what felt like an hour, heart hammering, until I convinced myself it was an animal. Still, the fear lingered. Over the next day, I became increasingly vigilant. I checked the perimeter of the cabin, making sure there were no signs of intrusion. I barricaded windows as best I could, moved furniture strategically, and kept a constant watch. I tried to distract myself with chores, cleaning, organizing supplies, cutting firewood, but the tension never left. Every noise in the forest, every shadow, felt like a threat. I realized I was becoming hyper-aware, paranoid, but the feeling was rational in its own way. Something wasn't right. I just didn't know what. On the third night, the fear escalated. Around midnight, I woke to the sound of heavy breathing just outside the cabin. It wasn't faint. It was deliberate, close enough that I could hear the rhythm, the pause, the inhale and exhale. I grabbed my flashlight and edged toward the window. The beam swept over the clearing, over the thick trees, and for a moment I saw movement. A shape moving low to the ground between the trees. It ducked behind a tree, disappearing before I could see more. My heart pounded. I realized I had to make a choice. I could stay and wait, trying to endure, or I could leave and get back to safety, no matter how difficult it would be in the dark. I chose to leave. I grabbed my backpack, packed essentials, food, water, my phone, and the flashlight, and quietly slipped out the back door. The night was black, the forest impenetrable, but I knew the dirt road not far from the cabin. Every step was careful, every snap of a twig amplified in my ears. I kept my flashlight off as much as possible, not wanting to reveal myself. After what felt like hours, I reached the road, my legs trembling, my chest tight. I ran, careful of the uneven ground, and finally reached my car. I locked the doors behind me and sat inside, catching my breath. The engine roared to life, and I drove away, not stopping until I reached a main highway far from the forest. The drive home was long and exhausting. My hands were sore from gripping the wheel, my eyes dry from staring at the road. I didn't sleep until I reached the city, and even then, I woke several times, panicked and alert, feeling the shadows of the forest pressing in. I never went back to that cabin. I reported the incident to the local authorities, mentioning the strange movements and sounds I had experienced, but they found nothing. No one else had been there, no signs of break-in, nothing tangible. I realized afterward that the isolation, combined with the dense forest and my heightened awareness, had made me vulnerable to fear in a way I hadn't anticipated. But whatever had been there, or even if nothing had been, my instincts had been right to leave. Weeks later, I researched the area, looking for similar reports. I found a few mentions online of hikers encountering suspicious people in the forest, sometimes hunters, sometimes vagrants, sometimes unknown. It was clear that while the area was beautiful and remote, it was also risky for someone alone. The experience changed me. I learned to respect the isolation, to prepare for the unexpected, and to trust my instincts. I never returned to a cabin alone in the wilderness after that. I kept hiking, but always in groups, always with a plan to leave quickly if something felt wrong. I realized that fear, when grounded in reality, is a warning, not a weakness. Years later, I still remember that cabin vividly. The creaking floors, the wind in the trees, the feeling of being watched, and the desperate flight through the forest at night. I remember the sense of relief when I reached my car, and the lingering unease that reminded me to respect nature, isolation, and the instincts that keep us alive. The experience taught me caution, awareness, and the importance of preparation. I never forgot that cabin, and I never forgot what it meant to truly feel alone in the wilderness, with only the faint hope of safety beyond the trees. I had been looking forward to this trip for months. The idea of escaping the noise and clutter of the city and spending a few days alone in a cabin deep in the woods felt like the only thing that could finally give me peace. I had found the cabin listed online. A small, rustic place about 2 hours outside of town. The photos made it look perfect. A single-story log cabin tucked into a clearing, with a small creek nearby and forest stretching in every direction. The description was simple. Electricity powered by a generator, running water, a wood stove, and no cell service. That last part was what made it ideal. No distractions, no interruptions, just isolation. I left the city early in the morning, carrying only the essentials. A backpack with food, water, a first aid kit, a flashlight with extra batteries, a small axe, a hunting knife, and a few books. The drive was long and winding, the kind of road where the trees almost met overhead to form a tunnel. I passed a few houses scattered along the way, most of them abandoned or looking like they hadn't been touched in decades. The further I drove, the quieter it became, until the only sounds were the engine and the occasional bird or rustle of a deer in the underbrush. Felt good. Felt right. When I finally arrived at the cabin, the sun was just starting to dip behind the trees, casting long shadows over the clearing. The cabin was exactly as the pictures had shown. Weathered logs, a moss-covered roof, and a small porch that creaked when I stepped on it. The windows were dirty, but I could see the outline of the furniture inside. A wooden table, 2 chairs, a sofa, and the wood stove at the corner. I parked my car next to the cabin and immediately felt a strange weight lift off my shoulders. There was nothing around for a mile in any direction. No sounds of traffic, no voices, just the forest. I spent the first hour just walking around the clearing, stretching my legs and familiarizing myself with the surroundings. The creek nearby was shallow, but the water was clear. I filled a couple of bottles and marked the path back to the cabin so I wouldn't get lost. I noticed a trail that seemed to lead deeper into the woods, barely visible, covered in fallen leaves and pine needles. Part of me wanted to explore, but the sun was setting fast, and I knew it would be better to stay put. I made a mental note to check it out in the morning. Inside, I set up the small wood stove and stacked some firewood nearby. I had a lantern and a flashlight ready, and I unpacked my supplies neatly. It was a small space, but I liked the simplicity. I had brought enough food to last several days, and the isolation felt comforting. I made a simple meal on a camping stove, a can of beans heated with some bread, and then sat by the window, looking out at the darkening forest. The wind picked up slightly, rustling the leaves, and I felt a shiver run down my spine. Not from fear, just from the cold. Night in the forest is different from the city. It has a weight to it, a density that makes the air feel thicker, like it's pressing in around you. I slept lightly that first night. The creaking of the cabin, the occasional snapping of a branch outside, and the distant sound of water flowing in the creek kept me half awake. At one point, I thought I saw movement just beyond the edge of the clearing, but when I looked closer, there was nothing. A deer, perhaps, or just my imagination playing tricks. I convinced myself of that and eventually fell asleep, though I remember waking up several times to check the windows. The next morning, I woke early. The forest was bathed in a pale gray light, mist rising from the creek and curling around the trees. I had a quick breakfast and decided to explore the trail I had noticed the day before. I left the cabin with my backpack, filled water bottles, a flashlight in case I stayed out too long, and the knife strapped to my belt. The trail was narrow, overgrown in parts, and I had to push through branches and ferns. It led uphill at first, the incline steep enough that I was sweating by the time I reached the top. From there, the forest stretched endlessly, trees towering on either side. It was beautiful in a stark, intimidating way, the kind of beauty that makes you feel small and aware of just how alone you are. About an hour in, I realized the trail wasn't really a trail. It had been used before, I could tell that much, small footprints, the broken branches, but it wasn't maintained. It wound into the forest like a forgotten path, and I began to consider turning back. But curiosity pushed me forward. That's when I first saw the cabin in the distance. It was small, hidden in a hollow, with smoke rising from the chimney. At first, I thought it was abandoned like the ones I had passed on the drive here. Then I noticed movement, a figure. I froze. The figure was standing by the door, watching me. I couldn't see much. It was just a silhouette, but I could tell it was a man. He didn't move, didn't wave or shout, just stood there. I didn't know if he had seen me, and for the first time since leaving the city, I felt genuine fear. My mind raced. Should I call out? Should I turn back? I decided on caution and slowly retreated, keeping my eyes on him until he disappeared behind the trees. I didn't know who he was, or if he had been watching me from the moment I left the cabin. When I got back, my stomach was tight with nerves. I didn't see him again that day, but I kept noticing small signs. A footprint in the dirt near the edge of the clearing. A branch snapped as if someone had walked through it. The faint sound of something moving outside at night. I didn't want to believe I was being watched, but the signs were too clear. I reinforced the doors, made sure the windows were locked, and kept a flashlight within reach. I slept lightly, one eye open, listening for every sound. The next day, I tried to ignore it. I went for a long walk along the creek, noting every detail. The way the water flowed over the rocks, the smell of damp earth, the rustling of the trees. I collected some dry wood along the way and brought it back to the cabin, stacking it near the stove. I told myself I was being paranoid, that maybe someone else had rented a nearby cabin or was camping unseen. But that night, when I was preparing to sleep, I heard footsteps outside, slow, deliberate, circling the cabin. My heart pounded. I grabbed my knife and crept to the window, shining my flashlight into the darkness. I saw nothing, but the sound continued for what felt like hours. By the third night, I was exhausted and on edge. The forest no longer felt peaceful. It felt alive in a way that was hostile, as if it was hiding something just beyond my sight. I stayed close to the cabin, kept the doors locked, and refused to go outside after dark. Around midnight, I heard the unmistakable sound of the front door handle rattling. Someone was trying to open it. My pulse spiked. I grabbed the knife and waited, listening to every sound. After a few tense minutes, it stopped. I didn't sleep for the rest of the night. The next morning, I knew I had to act. I couldn't stay inside, but I couldn't risk wandering the woods either. I packed my backpack quickly with essentials and decided to hike out, taking a different path I had noticed leading toward a logging road about 2 miles away. I moved quietly, checking behind me every few steps, imagining the man from before tracking me. The forest felt oppressive, every sound amplified, every shadow suspicious. I stayed on the trail, moving fast but carefully. Hours passed. I was tired, hungry, and my legs ached from constant climbing and walking. Then I heard voices in the distance, shouting. Relief flooded through me. They were coming from the logging road. I ran toward the sound, waving my arms, shouting. It took several minutes, but eventually, a truck appeared, headlights cutting through the trees. I ran into the clearing and waved frantically. The truck stopped, and two men stepped out. I explained as best I could, pointing toward the cabin and describing the man I had seen. They nodded, called someone on their radio, and offered to drive me back to town. I never went back to that cabin. A few days later, I learned from the local authorities that someone had been living illegally in an abandoned cabin not far from the one I rented. They had been watching the rental cabins, sometimes approaching people who stayed alone, taking food or threatening them. I realized how close I had been to real danger. The experience stayed with me. I couldn't stop thinking about how easy it had been for someone to hide in the forest, how quickly my peaceful escape had turned into fear and survival. But I also realized the importance of preparation, awareness, and trusting instincts. I had left the cabin alive, had taken steps to protect myself, and had gotten out before it could escalate. I still think about the forest and the isolation, but now I understand that even in the quietest, most beautiful places, danger can be real, and it pays to respect it. From then on, whenever I go camping or stay in a remote cabin, I check everything twice, make sure someone knows my plans, and never underestimate the forest or the people who might be hiding in it. The memory of that cabin, of the footsteps outside my door, and of the shadowy figure watching me is always there, but it's also a reminder of how to survive, how to pay attention, and how to value the safety that so many people take for granted. The forest is beautiful, but it can be ruthless, and no amount of photos or descriptions can prepare you for the raw reality of being truly alone. I didn't plan to stay in the cabin for long, but when I arrived at the tiny settlement tucked in the middle of the mountains, I knew I would. The cabin was older than I expected, built from thick logs that had darkened with age, and it sat alone on a small clearing surrounded by tall pine trees. The mountains rose in jagged peaks behind it, their tips hidden in low clouds, and a thin mist hung over the forest floor, dampening everything and giving the air a cold, earthy smell. I had driven for hours on a gravel road that wound between cliffs and streams, my hands tight on the wheel, seeing nothing but trees, rocks, and the occasional abandoned shack. It felt as if the world beyond this place didn't exist. The cabin had a small wooden porch that creaked under my weight as I stepped out of the car. Its roof sagged in places, and some of the boards were uneven, but it seemed solid. The windows were dirty, clouded with dust and old cobwebs. I noticed the front door didn't have a modern lock, just a simple metal latch that rattled when I moved it, pushed it open and entered. Inside, the air smelled of damp wood and something faintly metallic. Dust lay thick on the floorboards, and the furniture was sparse and old. A small table stood in the corner, with a few wooden chairs, and a single bed with a worn mattress leaned against the far wall. In one corner, a wood stove sat cold and unused. Sunlight filtered through the dirty windows, making the room feel dim and still. I set my bag down and took a slow look around. Everything in the cabin suggested it had been empty for months, maybe years. Yet it had a strange comfort. The walls were thick, the windows small, and the isolation felt protective in a way. I walked to the back door and stepped outside, where a small fire pit had been dug into the ground. There were old cans and ashes from previous fires, some half buried in dirt. I realized no one had been here recently. That thought made me feel both uneasy and relieved. If I was alone, I was safe from anyone else, but the isolation also made me aware of how vulnerable I was. The first night was cold. I built a fire in the stove after gathering dry wood from around the cabin, listening to the crackle and pop of the flames as they grew. The wind howled through the trees outside, making the branches scrape against the roof. I sat close to the stove, the warmth radiating on my face, and tried to focus on simple things. Checking my supplies, organizing my bag, making sure I had enough food and water. Despite all of that, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. I told myself it was just my imagination, the silence and the darkness playing tricks on my mind. But every shadow in the room seemed longer than it should be, every creak of the cabin louder than normal. I kept the fire going late into the night, knowing that if it died, I would be left alone in near total darkness. I finally went to bed with the small lantern lit on the floor, the flame flickering weakly, and tried to sleep. The next day, I explored the surrounding area. The forest was thick, dense with pine and spruce, the ground soft with fallen needles. There were animal tracks around the clearing, deer and smaller mammals, maybe a fox or raccoon. But I noticed something strange. There were no bird calls. I usually expect to hear birds, even in winter, but the forest was unnervingly quiet. Even the wind seemed muted. As I walked further from the cabin, the terrain became rougher, rocks jutting out, small streams cutting through moss-covered banks. I found a small path, likely created by people, but it ended abruptly at a cliffside, the drop steep and dangerous. I turned back, feeling uneasy. The isolation of the place was starting to feel heavier. Something about the air made me tense, like the forest itself was holding its breath. That evening, I prepared another fire and cooked some simple food. I tried to focus on mundane tasks, stacking firewood, cleaning the stove, checking my supplies, but every sound outside, every creak of the cabin, made me tense. I thought I saw shadows moving just beyond the edge of the clearing, but when I looked, there was nothing. I kept the lantern close and didn't sleep well that night, waking several times at the sound of branches snapping or something moving outside. The darkness pressed against the windows, and every little noise felt amplified. I began to realize that being alone here was not just about solitude, it was about being vulnerable. There was no one to help if something went wrong. By the third day, my nerves were frayed. I decided to stay inside as much as possible, exploring only the immediate area around the cabin. I noticed signs of small animals, scraps of fur, claw marks on the wood, faint footprints in the mud, but also something else. I found broken branches around the perimeter of the clearing, as if someone or something had walked around it carefully. The thought unsettled me. I had been alone the entire time, and yet there were signs that someone else had been here. The air carried a faint scent of smoke, not from my fire, but from somewhere else, distant yet deliberate. I locked the latch on the door and kept my knife close. I didn't want to admit it, but fear was creeping in, making me tense with every sound. The nights became the worst. Every small noise outside felt magnified. The scraping of a branch, the rustling of leaves, the faint snap of a twig. Once, I was certain I saw movement beyond the trees, a shadow passing just at the edge of the clearing. My heart raced, and I held my breath, straining to see. There was nothing there, but the feeling of being watched didn't leave me. I slept with my back against the wall, the knife under my pillow, the lantern burning low. Even during the day, I couldn't shake the unease. I began keeping a routine, gathering wood, checking supplies, and constantly scanning the forest. I could not let myself relax. Every creak of the cabin floorboards felt like a warning. Every wind gust through the trees sounded like someone walking. The fear was relentless, gnawing at the edges of my mind. On the fifth day, things escalated. I went to collect water from a small stream nearby. The path there was uneven, muddy from a recent rain, and the forest seemed darker than usual. As I bent down to fill my bottle, I heard the faintest snap behind me. I froze, convinced it was someone following me. I stayed still, listening, my heart hammering. There was a rustle, then silence. Slowly, I straightened and looked around. Nothing. I drank the water quickly, my hands shaking, and returned to the cabin as fast as I could without slipping. When I locked the door behind me, I noticed fresh footprints in the mud near the porch. They were human, large, heavy boots. Someone had been here while I was away, close enough to the cabin to see me. The realization hit me like ice. I was not alone, and this was no random camper or hiker. This was someone intentionally watching, stalking, waiting. The next few days were a blur of fear. I didn't leave the cabin except at dawn, and only then for a few minutes. I reinforced the door as best as I could, stacking firewood and furniture against it. I found old boards in the shed behind the cabin and nailed them across the windows, making it harder to see inside. Every sound outside made me flinch. Once, I saw a shadow move across the boards I had just nailed. Someone was trying to look in. My stomach knotted, and I realized I had to be ready to defend myself. I started gathering anything that could be a weapon. The knife, a heavy metal poker from the stove, an old axe I found in the shed. I prepared myself mentally for confrontation, telling myself I would survive, no matter what. The nights were worst of all. The first night after seeing the footprints, I barely slept. Every shadow outside seemed alive, every rustle a threat. I stayed awake, sitting by the window with the knife and axe, scanning the darkness. Hours passed. I started hearing low sounds, footsteps, the crunch of leaves and twigs. Sometimes I thought I heard whispering, but I couldn't be sure. My mind was playing tricks. My body was tense, muscles coiled like springs. Sleep became impossible. I realized that fear itself was wearing me down, making every simple task take twice as long, making me jump at the smallest noise. I rationed my food carefully, knowing I might have to survive here for longer than expected. Every night, I checked the perimeter, reinforced the doors, and prepared my weapons. By the 10th day, I was exhausted, living on minimal sleep and constant alertness. I decided I could not stay entirely passive. I needed to understand what I was dealing with and maybe to end it before it ended me. I started observing the surrounding forest carefully during the day, looking for movement, listening for sounds, trying to see patterns. I noticed that the figure moved mostly at night and avoided the main paths during the day. They were patient, methodical, waiting for me to make a mistake. I also realized that they could not get inside the cabin easily. The reinforced door and windows were deterrents. That gave me hope, but I knew I could not wait forever. On the 12th day, I heard something I will never forget. A branch snapped directly behind the cabin. I froze, knowing they were close. I grabbed the axe and slowly crept to the back door, listening. There was silence, then a soft thud, like a heavy boot hitting wood. I turned, and just at the edge of the clearing, I saw movement. A figure was crouched near the trees, watching me. I held the axe firmly, feeling the weight in my hands, my fingers numb. The figure froze, probably realizing I had seen them. We stared at each other for what felt like hours, though it was only seconds. Then, slowly, they backed away into the trees and vanished. That night, I could barely think. I stayed awake, preparing for confrontation, but I also realized something else. I had to leave. The cabin, as isolated and seemingly safe as it was, could not protect me forever. The person outside could be patient. They could wait me out. I had to go while I still had a chance. I planned carefully, waiting until first light, gathering my minimal supplies, hiding my preparations, and making sure I would not leave obvious tracks that would give them an advantage. At dawn, I left. The forest was cold and damp, but I moved as quickly as I could, careful not to stumble. I followed a path I had seen before that led to the gravel road I had driven in on. I kept my eyes on every shadow, my ears straining for any sign of pursuit. Hours passed, but the figure never appeared. The road stretched ahead, winding through the mountains, until finally, I reached my car. I got in, locked the doors, and started the engine. Relief flooded me, but I remained tense, scanning the trees as I drove. The forest swallowed the cabin behind me, hiding it in mist and shadow. Weeks later, I thought about the cabin constantly. The isolation, the fear, the sense of being hunted. It left a mark I could not shake. I realized I had survived because I had prepared, because I had stayed aware, because I had faced the fear directly rather than ignoring it. The experience taught me about vulnerability, about the thin line between safety and danger, and about the patience of someone determined. The cabin itself was not dangerous. It was the world outside it, the unknown, the person watching from the shadows, that made it terrifying. I never returned, and I never planned to, but I will never forget it, and I will never forget the lesson it taught me. In the wilderness, in isolation, you are only as safe as your awareness, your courage, and your ability to act. I had been planning this solo trip to the cabin for months. It wasn't far from the main road, but far enough that few people came around. Deep in a stretch of forest where the trees grew tall and thick, blotting out sunlight and swallowing sound. I needed the escape more than I could say. Work had been exhausting, life had been noisy, and the city had pressed on me in a way that left me restless, hollowed out, and desperate for quiet. The cabin I rented was small, built of dark logs that smelled faintly of pine and mildew, tucked against a slope that led down to a creek. The owners had assured me it was safe, that the neighbors were far enough away that I would have total privacy. I wanted that privacy, silence, nothing but the wind, the forest, and me. The drive there had been long. I packed the car the night before, loading food, water, batteries, a heavy lantern, and a first aid kit. I didn't trust my phone to work up there. I had only cell service at the very beginning of the access road. That added to the feeling of isolation I craved. As the car rolled up the narrow dirt track, lined with pines and spruces, I felt my chest loosen. The smell of damp soil and rotting leaves drifted in through the cracked window, earthy and clean in a way the city could never give. When I finally reached the cabin, I stepped out and stretched, feeling the rough wood of the railing under my hands. The porch creaked under my weight, the smell of old smoke and wood polish drifting up from inside. Everything looked exactly as it had in the photos, and yet, somehow more imposing, more quiet, more alone. Inside, the cabin was small but solid. The floorboards were worn, scratched in places where time had left its mark. The walls lined with the same dark logs I'd seen from outside. The main room had a fireplace, which I immediately checked, making sure the flue was open and the chimney clear. I ran my hands over the mantel, feeling the rough texture of the wood. There was a small kitchen area with a sink, a fridge that hummed faintly, and a table with 2 chairs. A bedroom with a single bed and a thick quilt was down a short hallway, and a bathroom with a shower and a small stack of towels completed the interior. Everything was clean, though it smelled faintly of dampness and old wood. It was perfect for what I wanted: solitude and a little bit of challenge. I spent the first few hours unpacking, putting my supplies in neat piles, checking the lanterns and filling water bottles. I lit a small fire in the fireplace just to test it, watching the flames catch, the smoke rise into the flue and disappear. Outside, the sun was dropping behind the thick pines, the sky turning pink and purple. I felt a light shiver of excitement as I realized I'd be entirely alone by nightfall. By the time darkness settled, the forest had changed completely. The air grew colder and thicker, the sounds sharper. Insects hummed faintly, the wind rustled the branches, and far off, I could hear the trickle of the creek. It was exactly as I had imagined. Quiet, but alive. The first night passed without incident. I sat near the fireplace, writing in a small journal, noting details about the cabin and the forest, the way the wind sounded in the trees, the smell of wet wood and moss. The fire flickered against the walls, casting long shadows. I slept fitfully, as one does when alone in an unfamiliar place, but nothing happened. When morning came, I opened the curtains and saw sunlight cutting through the trees, illuminating a thick carpet of fallen leaves. I felt a small thrill, knowing that for the next few days I would have nothing but this: the forest, the cabin, and myself. The second day, I decided to explore the immediate area. The forest was dense but walkable, with small animal tracks in the dirt. Deer, maybe raccoons, squirrels. The creek that ran near the cabin was shallow and clear. I followed it a short way, climbing over rocks and fallen branches, feeling the cold water touch my shoes and legs. It was peaceful, almost meditative, and I told myself I would take notes, maybe even sketch the creek. By the time I returned to the cabin, I was tired but satisfied. I lit another fire, cooked a simple meal, and settled back into my small routines. Cleaning, organizing, walking outside, watching the shadows stretch across the forest floor. It was on the third night that things began to shift, subtly at first. I was sitting near the fireplace when I heard a noise outside. Just outside the window, a faint scrape. I froze, straining to hear. The wind had been picking up, rattling the windows, shaking the trees, so I told myself it must have been a branch. I tried to ignore it. Then, a few minutes later, there was another sound, softer this time, like the crack of a twig under a heavy foot. I stiffened again, my heart beating faster. I remembered I had locked the doors. Still, instinct made me glance out the window. The porch was empty. Nothing moved. No lights, no shapes. Just the forest, dark and unyielding. I stayed near the fire until it burned low, convincing myself I was imagining it. Sleep came late. Morning brought a sense of relief. The sunlight, again, erased the tension. I went outside to inspect the area. Nothing seemed disturbed. No footprints, no signs of anyone or anything having been near the cabin. The feeling of unease faded, replaced by my usual enjoyment of the forest. I decided to take a longer walk that day, exploring deeper into the trees. I followed a faint trail, noting the moss-covered rocks, the fallen logs, the way the sunlight fell in patterns through the branches. The forest was alive but friendly. By the time I returned, the sense of threat I'd felt the night before was mostly gone. I told myself it was just nerves, that it was part of being alone in a place like this. But the fourth night was different. It began the same way. Dark settling over the cabin, the wind rattling the walls, the fire flickering. I was cooking a small dinner when I heard it again. The sound of scraping, slow and deliberate, coming from outside. My first thought was an animal. Maybe a bear? But the sound had a rhythm, a pattern that didn't feel natural. I froze, listening. There it was again. Scrape, scrape, pause, scrape. Something was moving around the cabin. My stomach sank. I checked the windows and doors, everything locked. Still, the feeling of being watched grew heavy and oppressive. I kept the fire going, sat with my back to the wall and tried to stay calm. I reminded myself I was on private property. There should be no one here. But the sound persisted. Sometimes it was at the edge of the porch, sometimes from the back of the cabin. I didn't dare look too closely, just listened, heart hammering. Hours passed. The wind howled, and the noises outside ebbed and flowed. At one point, the scraping stopped entirely. I told myself I had imagined it again. Then, without warning, a large shadow moved past the window. Something heavy, tall, moving with purpose. My pulse spiked. I stayed completely still, holding my breath, barely daring to blink. It stopped on the other side of the cabin, just out of sight, I assumed. Minutes later, it moved again. The feeling in my chest tightened, a mix of fear and adrenaline. I had no weapons except a heavy kitchen knife, which now sat on the table in front of me. I debated whether to call for help, but my phone had no signal. I was alone, completely alone. And someone or something was outside. The night dragged. I stayed awake, eyes fixed on every window, listening for any sound, any movement. At some point, the fire burned low, leaving me in near darkness, shadows crawling across the floor. The wind shifted, carrying new noises, branches snapping, leaves rustling, gravel crunching. I felt trapped, vulnerable. I tried to remind myself that rationally, it could be a person lost in the woods, a hunter, or even an animal. Still, the deliberate scraping and movement didn't match anything I had seen in the forest so far. My mind spun with worst-case scenarios. I barely slept. Every noise sent me jumping. Every shadow seemed alive. By morning, I was exhausted. The wind had died down, and the forest looked calm, harmless. I forced myself outside, inspecting the perimeter. That's when I noticed the footprints. Fresh, large, booted prints in the soft earth, circling the cabin, approaching from the main trail and disappearing into the trees behind. They were unmistakably human. Someone had been here, last night, while I slept, or while I stayed awake too terrified to move. Panic rose, hot and sharp. I checked the windows, saw a few scratches in the wood near the edges of the frames, small but deliberate. Someone had been testing the locks. Watching me, I decided I couldn't stay. I packed quickly, moving systematically, gathering all my supplies, grabbing the firewood and the food I had brought. The thought of leaving quickly, even in daylight, brought no relief. Just the tension of leaving behind the only place I could call my own for the week. As I packed, I scanned the forest constantly, looking for movement, expecting someone to step out from behind the trees. Nothing appeared. The silence was unbearable in its own way. By late morning, I was ready. I locked the cabin as best I could, checked the windows, and headed to my car. The trail seemed longer than before, the forest oppressive in its density. I kept my eyes on the tree-line constantly. The forest seemed to hold its breath around me. I reached the car finally, slid inside, locked the doors, and started the engine. Relief washed over me when the car moved, gravel crunching under the tires, and I saw no one behind me. I didn't look back. The drive down the access road was tense, each shadow, each bend making me flinch. But as I reached the main road, the isolation gave way to relief. I stopped once, turned to look back, and saw the cabin among the trees, quiet, still, completely empty. I realized I hadn't seen anyone, and maybe, perhaps, no one had meant harm. But I couldn't shake the fear, the presence I had felt, deliberate and patient, testing me, circling me. The forest itself seemed to hold the memory of it, a silent witness. When I finally reached the highway, the normality of cars, buildings, and people was almost unbearable. I was drained, shaken, and more alive in some strange way than I had been in years. I knew I would never forget that cabin, that forest, the long night of scraping and shadow, the terrifying realization that being alone is not always safe. I never returned to that place, and I never needed to. The forest held its secrets, and I had seen just enough to understand its silent warning. Isolation is precious, but it is also dangerous. Over the next days, I replayed everything in my head. Every sound, every shadow, every moment of dread. I told myself the forest was neutral, neither friend nor enemy. I had survived and I had learned. I didn't return to the cabin, but I kept the memory, the lessons, the sharp edge of fear that reminded me how fragile solitude can be, how careful one must be when alone, and how real danger can exist without warning, without reason, without ghosts. The cabin had been beautiful, the forest stunning, the solitude intoxicating. But I had left with a new respect for the dark, for the quiet, for the unknown that lurks in places no one else sees. And I carried that respect forward, knowing it had kept me alive. I had been driving all day, the kind of long, grinding journey where the landscape barely changes, but your eyes keep scanning for anything different, anything that would mark progress. The road had been narrow, lined with tall pines that blocked the horizon. The GPS said I was close, but the last few miles were unmarked. The sun had dropped low, slipping behind a bank of clouds, casting the forest into shadows that moved and shifted as the wind passed through the branches. I kept thinking about the cabin I had rented, an isolated place, supposedly perfect for writing, but the more I thought about it, the more the idea of being alone in the woods started to feel uncomfortable. Still, I told myself I was overthinking. I had been alone in the wilderness before. I had spent nights camping alone, sleeping under the stars, and while those nights had their own quiet unease, they had never felt dangerous. The cabin itself was tucked away down a narrow dirt track that was barely wide enough for my car. The GPS signal wavered, and I found myself stopping several times to check the map. When I finally saw the cabin, it looked smaller than the pictures online had shown. It was built of dark timber, and the roof sagged slightly. The windows were dirty, and I could not see inside, though I imagined a dusty interior with a fireplace, a small kitchen, and a few modest rooms. The porch was covered in dead leaves, and I noticed the wood was weathered and splintered. There was no other building in sight, no other road, no lights from anywhere. The isolation was complete. I parked, the engine turning off with a final click that sounded too loud in the quiet. I grabbed my bag, slung it over my shoulder, and walked up the steps. The air was cold, even though it was not winter yet. My lungs filled with the scent of wet leaves and pine, and I shivered, pulling my jacket tighter. The door creaked as I opened it, and the interior smelled of damp wood and mold. The floorboards groaned under my weight, and I could see dust motes in the shafts of fading light that came through the windows. I set my bag down and walked through the cabin, taking note of every corner. The kitchen was tiny, with a rusted sink and an old stove. A small table was pushed against the wall. There were a few chairs, but they were uneven, one leg shorter than the others, causing it to wobble dangerously. I walked into the living room. A fireplace dominated one wall, and the chimney looked old, maybe unsafe to use. There was a single armchair that had a tear in the fabric, and a couch with flattened cushions. I looked at the back wall where a window overlooked the forest. The shadows were growing longer outside, and I realized the sun had nearly set. I decided to get a fire going in the fireplace to warm the place. The woodpile outside looked damp, but I managed to find enough dry sticks to get a small flame. The first match I struck flared and died immediately. The second burned long enough for me to light a few kindling pieces, and soon a small fire crackled in the hearth. It cast an orange glow across the room, illuminating the corners and pushing back the darkness outside the windows. I felt slightly safer, though I knew the darkness beyond the cabin was only a few feet away. After setting up the fire, I unpacked my things. I had brought food, water, and notebooks. I had planned to spend a few days writing, getting away from everything, but as the first night settled in, I felt a growing unease. I moved through the rooms slowly, checking the doors and windows. There were 3 doors leading to bedrooms and 1 to the small bathroom. The doors closed with a dull thud, and the locks were old and fragile. I tested them. They worked, but not with confidence. Night fell fully, and with it came silence. The kind of silence that feels thick, pressing against your ears. No crickets, no wind rustling the leaves, just the faint sound of the fire crackling and the occasional drip of water somewhere in the cabin. I sat in the armchair, notebook on my lap, trying to write, but my mind kept wandering. Every shadow in the room seemed to stretch unnaturally, and I kept glancing at the windows, expecting to see movement outside. I told myself I was being ridiculous. Still, the isolation weighed on me. Around midnight, I heard the first sound that made me pause. A scraping noise outside the cabin. It was soft at first, almost imperceptible, like a branch brushing against the side of the house. I froze. My heart rate spiked. The sound came again, a slow, deliberate scrape. It moved along the wall, stopping just below one of the windows. My mind raced through possibilities. Animals, maybe a raccoon or a deer, but the pattern was strange, too calculated for a wild animal. I strained my ears, listening. The sound repeated, a slow, steady scratching along the cabin siding. I grabbed my flashlight from the table. Its beam cut a narrow path through the darkness outside. I shone it on the ground near the porch. Nothing. No animal tracks, no branch moving. I crouched, trying to see more, and then I heard it again. A heavier sound, like something large shifting near the edge of the porch. I stood slowly, my hand trembling slightly, and my heart pounding. I told myself to stay calm. I had come here to be alone. Nothing was going to hurt me, but as I moved toward the door to get a better look, the floorboard above me creaked. The sound was deliberate, like a step. I froze mid-step. That was impossible. No one else was in the cabin. My stomach turned cold. I backed away slowly from the door, trying to make as little noise as possible. I felt the fire's warmth, but it didn't reach the corners of the room, didn't reach the dark outside. Minutes passed. Long, slow minutes where every sound seemed amplified. The fire crackling, the wind moving leaves against the siding, my own breathing. I debated my next move. Should I leave? Could I get to my car without being seen? I did not know what I would be running from. I decided to stay put for a moment to observe. The next hour was torturous. Every sound outside made me jump. I saw shadows flick across the window, though there was no wind. A branch, maybe, but the movement seemed too large, too heavy for a branch alone. I remembered the old locks on the doors and felt a pang of fear. If someone wanted in, they could break them. Eventually, I realized the fire had died down. I had to do something. I took out my phone to check for service. Nothing. No signal. The thought of being completely cut off made my heart pound again. I grabbed the heaviest object I could find, a cast iron pan, and moved to the kitchen near the back door. I set it on the counter, ready to use if necessary. Hours passed. Every sound outside kept me tense. The wind picked up, rattling the cabin, making the shadows move in strange ways. Occasionally, I thought I saw a figure beyond the trees. My mind, exhausted, tried to rationalize it. Trees, branches, nothing more. By the time the sky began to lighten, I had not slept. I was tired, dehydrated, and terrified. I knew I needed to leave, but I did not know if it was safe. I moved slowly through the cabin, checking each door and window. Nothing appeared out of place, no signs of forced entry. The scratching, the heavy movements, they had stopped, but the fear lingered. When the first rays of sun broke through the clouds, I finally stepped outside. The air was cold, but it felt different in daylight. The forest no longer seemed threatening. I walked around the cabin, checking the perimeter. Nothing. No footprints, no disturbed leaves, nothing to indicate anyone had been here. It was as if the night had been imagined, except for the memory of every sound, every shadow, every heartbeat. I packed quickly, leaving nothing behind. The drive back on the narrow dirt road was tense, my hands gripping the steering wheel so tightly my knuckles ached. Every sound from the forest along the road made me flinch, but eventually, the road widened, the trees thinned, and I reached the main highway. The isolation of the cabin disappeared as I drove toward civilization, toward gas stations, restaurants, and people. When I finally reached home, I felt the tension in my body slowly release. I unpacked, showered, and tried to convince myself it had just been a combination of fatigue, isolation, and imagination. But the memory of the sounds, the feeling of being watched, remained vivid. I never went back to that cabin. I never even looked up the rental again. The idea of returning, even in daylight, was unbearable. I realized afterward that fear has a way of imprinting itself. The most terrifying moments are not always those with clear danger. Sometimes, they are moments when you feel completely alone, with no control, and no idea if the threat is real or imagined. That cabin had not been haunted. It had not been cursed. And there had been no supernatural force. The terror was entirely human, entirely real, the fear of isolation, of being watched, of the unknown. And that, I decided, was enough. I never stayed alone in a remote place again. Even small cabins, even isolated campsites, filled me with memories of that night. I kept telling myself I had survived, and I had left before anything could happen. But knowing I could be so completely terrified, so completely powerless, changed something in me. I learned the hard way that fear does not need a ghost, or a monster, or anything unreal. Fear is enough on its own. And in that cabin, in the dark, with no one around, fear was everything. Even months later, when I told the story to myself in my apartment, every detail of the cabin, the forest, the noises, came back as sharply as if it had happened yesterday. I could still hear the scratch against the siding, feel the floorboard creak above me, feel the weight of the isolation pressing down. I still shivered when I remembered the fire flickering in the hearth, the shadows on the walls, and I realized that what I had survived was more than just a night in a cabin. It was a night that showed me the fragility of safety, the power of uncertainty, and the depth of fear when you are alone and entirely exposed. That night, I understood something that I never wanted to forget. Survival is not about confronting monsters. It is about staying calm, making rational choices, and enduring until light returns. And light always returns. Always. Even now, when I walk into a forest or see a cabin tucked away behind the trees, I remember that night. I feel the pull of isolation, the way fear can twist every sound, every shadow, into a threat. But I also remember that I left, that I survived, that I made it back to safety. And that memory, the proof of endurance, gives me a quiet reassurance. I will not go back, and I do not need to, but I carry the lesson with me, clear and undeniable. Fear is real, isolation is powerful, but survival is possible, and even in the darkest, quietest night, there is always a way out. I had been looking forward to this weekend for months. A quiet retreat in the woods, away from the noise and constant pressure of the city. The cabin I rented was small but solid, located deep in a remote part of the forest, far from any main road. The directions were vague, marked by a single, barely visible sign, and I had to drive over an hour on a rough dirt path, through winding trees and occasional fallen branches, before finally reaching it. The cabin looked older than the pictures online suggested, but that only added to its charm. It was made of thick logs with a steep, sloped roof, a small stone chimney, and a single narrow window on each side. A thin layer of moss covered parts of the roof, and the smell of wet earth and pine was immediate when I stepped out of the car. I had arrived in the late afternoon, just as the sun was beginning to dip behind the tall pines. The forest was quiet, save for the distant sound of a creek and the occasional rustle of small animals moving through the undergrowth. I unlocked the cabin, pushing the heavy wooden door, and immediately felt a wave of relief wash over me. Inside, the air was cooler, damp but not unpleasant, carrying the faint smell of old wood and fireplace smoke. Dust motes danced in the golden shafts of sunlight that filtered through the windows. The cabin was simple: a small living area with a wooden table, 2 chairs, a wood-burning stove, and a tiny kitchen space with basic utensils. A narrow staircase led to a loft above, where the bedroom was tucked under the sloped roof. I spent the first hour unpacking and settling in, laying out my sleeping bag, organizing food supplies, and making sure the firewood was stacked neatly next to the stove. I wanted everything to be in order. The isolation was both exciting and a little unnerving. As the sun sank lower, the shadows of the trees stretched across the cabin floor, and the dimming light made the interior feel smaller, tighter, like the walls were closing in. I reminded myself that this was why I had come, to disconnect and enjoy the peace. By evening, I had the fire going, the flames crackling and throwing a warm orange glow across the room. I ate a simple dinner, watching the dark forest outside the window. The wind picked up, whispering through the branches and rattling the loose boards on the cabin exterior. It was normal, I told myself, just the wind and the old wood settling. I went to bed early, sleeping in the loft under the thick blankets I had brought, and the first night passed uneventfully, though the forest noises outside were louder than I expected. Twigs snapping, animals moving, distant calls. It all sounded unnervingly close. The next morning, I woke to mist hanging low in the forest, dampening the ground and cloaking the cabin in a gray haze. I had planned to hike, so I packed a small day bag with water, snacks, a flashlight, and my pocket knife. The trailhead was nearby, though not well marked. I followed the faint path, careful to note landmarks as I moved. The forest was eerily quiet compared to the previous night. No birds, no rustling animals, just the crunch of my boots on damp leaves. I kept moving, telling myself I needed to stay alert and not get lost. By midday, I had gone further than I expected, reaching a small clearing with a creek running through it. The water was clear and cold, and I knelt to take a drink, refilling my bottle. That's when I noticed something odd: tracks. Human footprints, fresh, leading deeper into the woods. They weren't like the occasional hiker or camper tracks. These were deliberate, heavy, and seemed to come from someone moving with purpose. My stomach tightened. I thought about heading back, but curiosity and stubbornness pushed me forward. I followed the tracks, careful to step lightly, scanning the trees for any signs of who had passed this way. Hours passed. The trail became less distinct, and the tracks disappeared at a fallen log. I sat on the log, listening, but all I could hear was the creek, my own breathing, and the distant wind. I considered turning back. The sun was already low, and I knew I had to return before darkness fell. As I retraced my steps, I realized something unsettling. I couldn't remember exactly which way I had come. The forest all looked the same. Tall pines, thick underbrush, uneven ground. I tried to stay calm, using the position of the sun as a guide, but the shadows lengthened quickly. Within what felt like minutes, The clearing was swallowed by dusk, and the temperature dropped sharply. I could feel a damp chill seep into my clothes. The panic started quietly at first, a gnawing in the back of my mind, but it grew as the light faded. I turned in circles, trying to find the trail. Every direction looked identical. My flashlight was in my bag, but I didn't want to rely on it too early, knowing the battery was limited. I called out, my voice sounding absurdly loud in the emptiness, bouncing off unseen trees, but there was no answer, only silence. My heart pounded, and I forced myself to breathe slowly, trying to map my surroundings in my mind. But every tree looked the same, every shadow the same. Then I heard it, a snapping branch, sharp and deliberate, somewhere behind me. I froze, straining to hear, but it was gone. My imagination, I told myself. Nothing was there. I turned and kept moving, faster now, carefully stepping over roots and rocks. But then I saw movement. A figure, dark, crouched behind a tree. I couldn't tell if it was human or just a trick of the fading light. I froze again, heart in my throat. The figure didn't move, but I felt eyes on me. My rational mind screamed to run, but I knew I could get more lost in panic. I started moving again, zigzagging through the forest, keeping low, trying to find anything familiar. The wind carried an ominous sound, low, muffled, like distant footsteps following me. My muscles burned from exertion, and cold sweat ran down my back. I stumbled, scraping my knee on a rock, but didn't stop. The forest seemed endless, oppressive, and every shadow looked like it could hide someone waiting. Hours passed, or maybe minutes. It was impossible to tell in the darkness. My flashlight was finally out, leaving me in near total black. I relied on memory and touch, brushing against trees, trying to find the path. I fell several times, scraping my hands and knees, my backpack snagging on branches. Exhaustion threatened to overtake me, and the thought of spending the night alone in the woods, lost, began to crush me. Then faintly I saw it, a light, dim but steady. My pulse quickened. I ran toward it, praying it was the cabin. The light turned out to be from the cabin's window. Relief hit me like a wave, and I ran the last few meters, tripping and falling on the porch. I scrambled up, fumbling with the keys I had left in my pocket, and finally pushed the door open. Inside, the warmth of the fire I had left smoldering was immediate, and I collapsed on the floor, shivering, exhausted, and covered in scratches and mud. My pulse finally slowed as I stared at the familiar cabin interior, the walls, the furniture, the loft above. I was safe. I had made it back. The rest of the night passed slowly. I stayed in the loft, wrapped tightly in blankets, listening to the forest outside. I heard animals moving, the wind, branches breaking, but none of it scared me the way being lost had. I realized how vulnerable I had been, how fragile the boundary was between safety and being truly alone in the forest. I resolved that I would be more careful, that I would never underestimate the woods or my own disorientation again. The next morning, I packed up my things, careful not to leave anything behind. I lit a small fire to warm the cabin for the next visitor and walked slowly back down the dirt road, paying careful attention to landmarks. By the time I reached the main road, I was exhausted but immensely relieved. The city appeared in the distance, lights glinting through the morning haze, and I felt a profound sense of return, of having survived something much bigger than myself. Looking back, the experience taught me respect for the forest. It wasn't magical or haunted. It was just real, raw, and indifferent to human presence. And while I would return someday, I would never take the wilderness lightly again. I would make sure I had maps, extra supplies, and a method to navigate. I would respect its vastness and my own limits. I had survived, not by luck or myth, but by persistence, calm thinking, and sheer will. The cabin, standing there silently, was a reminder that sometimes the scariest things in life are not monsters, but being alone and unprepared in a world that doesn't bend to human needs. By the end of that trip, I understood a simple truth. Fear is real, but preparation, patience, and awareness can turn it into survival. And that realization, more than anything, left me with a quiet, enduring sense of control and relief that no fairy tale or legend could ever replicate. I never imagined that a quiet weekend getaway to a cabin in the woods could turn into one of the most terrifying experiences of my life. I had been looking forward to it for months, planning every detail meticulously. The cabin was tucked deep in the forest, far from any town, far from any roads that were more than dirt tracks. I wanted nothing but solitude, the kind of peace you only find when you leave the chaos of everyday life behind. The thought of sitting by a fire, reading, and hiking the surrounding trails sounded perfect. But what I found there wasn't peace. It was something else entirely, something I won't ever forget. The drive to the cabin itself had been uneventful, at least in the way a drive can be uneventful when you are alone with nothing but the sound of tires on gravel. I remember feeling a growing sense of isolation as the miles passed and the forest became denser. The trees grew closer together, and the sunlight filtered down in narrow streams. Every so often, I would see a flash of movement between the trunks. Probably deer, I told myself, but I felt a small tightening in my chest each time. By the time I reached the small dirt road that led to the cabin, I was already aware of just how alone I truly was. The cabin itself looked exactly like it had in the pictures. A modest wooden structure, weathered by years of wind and snow, with a stone chimney and a small porch. The windows were dark, reflecting the surrounding forest back at me. There was no sign of anyone else around. I parked my car and stepped out, the gravel crunching under my boots. The air smelled like pine and earth, and there was a strange stillness, as if the forest itself were holding its breath. I carried my bags to the cabin and unlocked the door. The smell inside was faintly musty, but not unpleasant. Dust lay in thin layers over the wooden floors, and the furniture looked solid and functional, not decorative. This place was real. It was remote, and it was entirely mine for the weekend. I unpacked slowly, deliberately, arranging my belongings and lighting the small wood stove in the corner. The fire flickered to life, warming the small room and pushing back the cold that had seeped into my bones during the drive. I unpacked food, extra clothes, and my small first aid kit, just as I always did. It was routine, comforting. By the time I finished, the sun was low, slipping behind the forest. Shadows stretched across the cabin floor, long and angular, and the only sound was the occasional crackle from the stove. That first night, I slept lightly. I had left the cabin windows open slightly, enjoying the crisp night air, and I woke several times to the sounds of the forest. At first, it was subtle. The scratching of branches, the distant thump of something moving through the leaves, maybe an animal. I tried to ignore it, convincing myself that the forest had always sounded like this. But somewhere deep in the night, there was a sound that didn't belong. It was rhythmic, deliberate, a scraping noise, like something being dragged across dirt. My stomach nodded, but I told myself it was nothing. A branch, a fallen log, some animal. I pulled the blanket tighter around myself and eventually fell back into a restless sleep. The next morning, I went outside early. The air was cold and sharp, the kind that makes your lungs ache slightly when you breathe it in. I walked the perimeter of the cabin, noting the small garden and the firewood stacked neatly. Everything seemed normal, almost too normal after the tension of the night before. As I explored the surrounding forest, I kept hearing odd noises, but they were always distant, always just on the edge of my perception. I found a small creek a short walk from the cabin, and the sound of running water calmed me somewhat. I spent the morning exploring, taking notes in a small journal about plants, animal tracks, and the uneven terrain. Felt safe, felt normal. By the time the second night arrived, my nerves were taut in a way I couldn't explain. I had tried to ignore the feelings of unease, but now they were harder to suppress. I was preparing dinner when I noticed the back door of the cabin had a faint scratch along the frame, something I was sure hadn't been there before. I leaned closer, inspecting it. The wood had a shallow groove, as if something sharp had been pressed against it and dragged. My pulse quickened. I searched the rest of the cabin, checking every window and door. Everything else was intact. Still, a sense of dread grew, knotting in my stomach. I was alone, or at least I should have been alone. I told myself it was the wind, or maybe a small animal, but my rational mind did nothing to quiet the fear creeping through me. As night fell, I decided to lock everything carefully, securing windows and doors. I set a few extra logs in the stove, just in case, and kept a knife on the table near me. Every creak of the cabin floor, every whisper of wind against the walls, set my nerves on edge. Hours passed slowly. I told myself to breathe, to relax, but sleep remained elusive. Then I heard it again. A scraping sound, deliberate, dragging along the dirt near the cabin. My heart raced. I crept to the window and peered out into the darkness. I couldn't see anything, but the sound persisted, stopping and starting in a pattern that made it unmistakably intentional. Whoever or whatever it was outside, moving around the cabin. Panic clawed at me, but I stayed still. I thought about running to the car, but it was on the far side of the cabin, and I didn't know if whoever was outside could see me through the dark. I considered staying put, trying to wait it out, but the sounds continued, circling the cabin, moving with precision. Something was watching me. I realized that there were no fairies, no ghosts, no fantastical monsters. It was real. Someone was here, and they were very aware of me. I remembered the small first aid kit in my bag and the heavy camping hatchet I had brought along. I moved to gather supplies quietly, avoiding the floorboards that creaked. I also remembered my phone, but there was no signal. The isolation that had seemed peaceful during the day was now suffocating. There was no way to call for help. I was truly alone with whoever or whatever was outside. I stayed up the rest of the night, knife and hatchet at my side, fire burning low in the stove. The sounds never stopped completely. Every so often, a branch snapped, a scraping sound near a window, or the distant crunch of leaves signaled movement. I could hear shallow breathing or the shifting of something heavy in the dirt outside. Exhaustion finally overtook me just before dawn, and I slept lightly, one ear listening, knife in hand. When morning finally came, I cautiously went outside. The first light revealed tracks in the mud, deep enough to be human. They had circled the cabin, coming close to the windows and doors. My heart sank. Whoever had been out there had been methodical, careful, and close. But the tracks stopped near the edge of the forest. It seemed the person had left, at least for the moment. I cleaned the cabin as best I could, checked the locks, and made mental notes about possible escape routes if the night returned with the same terror. Over the next 2 days, I stayed vigilant. I explored further during daylight, carrying the knife and keeping the car key on a chain around my neck. The forest felt different now, oppressive and quiet. Birds had disappeared, and the usual sounds of wildlife were absent. The feeling of being watched persisted. I discovered broken branches and more tracks around the perimeter, evidence that someone had been following my movements. I realized this wasn't random. Whoever had been here had studied the cabin, probably for days, maybe weeks. They had left for now, but I knew they could return at any time. The forest that had seemed tranquil was now hostile, full of hidden threats. On the fourth night, I resolved to act rather than wait. I drove into the nearest town the next morning, returning with a friend who knew survival skills and could bring backup. We fortified the cabin, setting up security measures, traps, and cameras. Over the next few days, we documented everything. Eventually, local authorities investigated and found evidence that a group of squatters had been using the area to watch travelers, sometimes even breaking into cabins. The people responsible had left before they could be caught, but the trail of their surveillance and intimidation was clear. I learned later that they had done this to multiple cabins over months, choosing remote locations to avoid detection. The experience left a mark. I realized how vulnerable I had been, how dangerous isolation could be when the wrong people were involved. But I also learned the value of preparation, vigilance, and knowing your environment. The cabin, once a place of potential fear, became a symbol of careful planning and reclaiming space. With locks, cameras, and knowledge, I returned to it safely, hiking during the day and keeping watch at night. The terror of those first nights never completely faded, but I survived, and I learned how to protect myself. That weekend had turned into a nightmare, but it ended not with tragedy, but with a clear understanding of the risks and the steps necessary to stay safe in the wild, far from civilization. I had been planning the trip for months, though not in any particular way that required much planning. I had always liked the idea of isolation, the quiet that comes from being deep in the woods, where the sounds of the world beyond barely exist. I didn't want a fancy vacation or a place with crowds and lights and schedules. I wanted solitude, and I thought a cabin in the remote part of the mountains would be perfect. The drive had been long. I left my apartment early in the morning, carrying a small backpack filled with essentials: food, water, a first aid kit, a flashlight with extra batteries, a small camping stove, and a few changes of clothes. I had rented the cabin for a week, tucked away near the end of a rough dirt road that the GPS barely recognized. The closer I got, the narrower the road became, until it was little more than a single lane with steep drops on either side and tree branches scratching the sides of my car. My phone signal was already weak, and I knew it might be non-existent once I reached the cabin. That was part of why I liked it. I arrived in the late afternoon. The cabin was smaller than I had imagined, but solid. It was old, built from rough logs that had darkened with age. The roof was covered in shingles, many of them chipped or slightly lifted, and the windows were dusty, streaked with the remnants of past storms. A small porch ran along the front, and the door creaked when I opened it. Inside, the smell of damp wood and old smoke filled the air. The cabin had a main living space with a small kitchen area, a wood stove, and a loft bedroom. Everything was simple, rustic, but functional. I unpacked my bags slowly, placing items in their places, trying to create a sense of normalcy and comfort. The first night fell quickly. I built a fire in the stove, lit a few candles, and made a small dinner of canned soup and bread. Outside, the wind rustled through the trees, and the sounds of birds and distant wildlife faded as darkness deepened. I settled in with a blanket and a book, but sleep did not come easily. The isolation felt heavy, and every little noise, the cracking of the wooden beams, the scraping of branches against the walls, seemed amplified. On the second day, I explored the surroundings. The cabin sat near a small clearing, surrounded by dense forest. A narrow trail led downhill toward a creek I had spotted on the map. The air was crisp, the sun filtered through the tall pines, and the forest floor was thick with leaves and fallen branches. I walked for hours, enjoying the solitude, the feeling of being completely alone in the world. I noticed old animal tracks, some deer, maybe a fox, but nothing that felt threatening. That night, I went to bed early, hoping for sleep, but again, I felt on edge. The sounds outside seemed louder. The wind picked up, rattling branches against the cabin, and I heard something moving near the edge of the clearing. I tried to tell myself it was an animal, a deer or a raccoon, nothing dangerous. But something about the way the sounds moved made me uneasy. I stayed awake for hours, flashlight by my side, listening. Eventually, exhaustion took over, and I fell into a fitful sleep. The third day brought a strange tension. I had gone further along the trail, finding another small path that led to a rock outcrop overlooking a distant valley. The view was breathtaking, the mountains stretching endlessly, the forest a deep green carpet. But as I descended back to the cabin, I noticed something odd. A set of footprints, human-sized, leading from the woods to the cabin. At first, I thought it was another hiker, but the tracks didn't match anything I had seen before. They were too large, too heavy, pressed deeply into the soft soil. I followed them carefully, but they disappeared into the undergrowth a few meters from the cabin. That evening, I locked the doors and windows, double-checking everything. I even stacked some firewood near the entrance, not for warmth but to feel safer, to create a barrier. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. The shadows outside seemed darker than usual, and every snap of a branch made me flinch. I told myself it was paranoia, that I was alone and safe. Yet the feeling lingered, gnawing at the edges of my mind. On the fourth day, I decided to stay inside most of the time. I chopped more firewood, cleaned the cabin, and tried to make it feel like a home. By mid-afternoon, the sun was low, and I noticed something unsettling through the window. A figure, partially hidden by the trees, standing and watching the cabin. I froze, my heart pounding. The figure didn't move for a long moment, then slipped back into the shadows. I didn't see a face, couldn't tell if it was a man or a woman. I felt panic rising, a cold, deep fear that made my hands shake. I wanted to leave, to drive back down the winding road, but the thought of going out into the dark forest alone felt equally terrifying. That night was the worst. I stayed awake, huddled near the stove, flashlight in hand. I could hear footsteps circling the cabin, slow and deliberate. The wind had picked up again, carrying the sounds of leaves and twigs, masking some of the movements, but not all. At one point, I thought I heard something scratching at the door. I didn't dare open it. I stayed still, holding my breath, listening. The sounds continued intermittently, fading and returning through the night. I barely slept, dozing in short bursts, waking at every noise. The fifth day, I knew I couldn't ignore the danger. I had brought my car keys inside, kept them close at all times. I made a plan. I would leave at first light, drive back down the dirt road, and not look back. But when I woke, I found something that made my stomach drop. The front door, which I had carefully locked, was slightly ajar. My first thought was that I had been careless, that the wind had pushed it open. But inside, I saw the signs of someone having been there. Items I had left on the table were moved. Footprints in the dust led from the door to the back of the cabin. I was not alone. I spent the day preparing to leave. I gathered my bag, double-checked the car, and kept a weapon close. A heavy metal wrench I had found in the shed. The sun began to set as I stepped outside. I looked around, trying to see if anyone was watching. The forest was still eerily quiet, as if it were holding its breath. I moved quickly to the car, keeping my back to the trees, scanning constantly. The headlights caught nothing, just the shadows of the trees. Driving down the dirt road was terrifying. Every branch that scratched the car, every sudden movement in the shadows made me jerk the wheel. I kept the windows up, doors locked, and pressed the accelerator harder than was safe. It took nearly an hour to reach the paved road, but finally, the trees thinned, and I saw the lights of a small town in the distance. Relief washed over me, but I didn't relax completely. I kept driving, only stopping once I was well past the mountains. I reported what happened to the local authorities the next day, though I had little evidence. Footprints in the dirt, the signs inside the cabin, but I wanted a record. They said that sometimes, cabins in remote areas attract people who watch and stalk, waiting for solitary visitors. I learned later that a man had been caught in the area, living in an abandoned cabin nearby, following and watching anyone who stayed in the rented cabins. It explained the footprints, the figure, the noises. The man was arrested, and I never returned to that part of the mountains. Even now, years later, the memory of that week stays with me. The isolation, the sounds in the dark, the feeling of being watched. It lingers. I can still see the figure in the trees, hear the scratching at the door. But I also remember how carefully I planned my exit, how I stayed calm enough to leave alive. I learned to respect the wilderness not just for its beauty, but for the very real dangers of being alone, completely isolated and vulnerable. Now, I tell the story to myself sometimes to remind me of the fragility of safety and the importance of being alert, aware, and prepared. The experience changed how I approach the world, made me cautious but also more resilient. And I never stayed in a remote cabin alone again. The fear, the tension, the quiet terror of those nights taught me a lesson I won't ever forget. I had been planning the trip for months, mostly as a way to escape everything. Work, people, noise, the constant hum of city life. The cabin was deep in the woods, far enough from the nearest road that it felt like it belonged to another world. The directions I found online were sparse but specific, telling me to follow an old dirt path past a creek, through a series of overgrown trails, and then up a small ridge where the cabin sat. When I finally arrived, I realized it was more isolated than I had imagined. There were no other houses in sight, no smoke curling from chimneys, Nothing but trees stretching endlessly in every direction. The air smelled clean, damp with moss and earth, and the faint sound of the creek below the ridge reached my ears. It should have felt peaceful, but something about the place put me on edge almost immediately. The cabin itself was small, rustic, and clearly old. The wood had darkened over the years, and the roof sagged slightly in the middle, but the structure seemed sound. A thin layer of leaves had gathered around the porch, and the windows were dusty, though not broken. I had checked the cabin on a map, and it had running water and electricity, but it was clear it had not been visited in some time. I parked my car at the base of the ridge and hiked up, my backpack heavy with food, a first aid kit, extra clothes, and a small emergency kit I always carried when I went anywhere remote. As soon as I stepped onto the porch, I noticed the silence. No birds were singing. The wind rustled the leaves, but even that sounded muffled. I shook off the feeling of unease and pushed open the door. The smell inside was a mixture of dust, damp wood, and faint mildew. There were cobwebs in the corners, and a thin layer of dust covered the floorboards. The furniture was minimal: an old wooden table, a few chairs, a small bed in the corner, and a wood-burning stove. I checked the stove, and it had a pile of cold ashes inside, remnants of someone's last fire. I made a mental note to clean it out before lighting it, knowing that starting a fire would help me feel a little safer in this quiet, isolated place. I spent the first few hours unpacking, organizing my things, and checking every corner of the cabin. The cupboards were empty, and the refrigerator hummed faintly but was empty. I had brought my own food, so it wasn't a problem, but it added to the feeling of isolation. By the time evening arrived, the sun was low, painting the trees in dark oranges and reds. I lit the stove and sat near it, feeling the heat wash over me. Outside, the shadows deepened, and the forest grew darker. I had brought a small lantern, which I set on the table to cast a soft glow across the room. The first night was restless. Every sound from the forest made me tense. Twigs snapping, leaves rustling, the distant call of an owl. It all seemed louder in the stillness. I told myself it was nothing, just animals moving around. Still, I had the uneasy feeling of being watched, though I knew logically that was impossible. The cabin was far from any trail, and no one else knew I was there. I tried to sleep, but every creak of the cabin made me jump. By the time dawn came, I was exhausted and had barely slept. The next morning, I decided to explore the area around the cabin. I wanted to make sure I knew the surroundings in case I needed to move quickly. The forest was thick, and the ground was uneven, covered with roots and fallen branches. I followed a narrow path down toward the creek I had noticed on the way in. The water ran clear and cold, tumbling over rocks and fallen logs. It felt peaceful, and for a moment, I relaxed, filling my water bottle and sitting on a rock to watch the flow. As I turned to head back to the cabin, I noticed something strange. Footprints in the mud. They were fresh, leading from the trees to the edge of the creek, but they didn't look like any animal prints I had ever seen. They were too large and deep to be a deer or a dog. I crouched to inspect them, tracing the outline with my fingers. The prints seemed human, but the toes were elongated, almost claw-like. My heart started to race. I considered that someone else might be in the area, but the trail didn't continue toward the road or any nearby cabins. It disappeared into the forest in a direction that didn't make sense, as though whoever made them had vanished. I rushed back to the cabin, my mind spinning. I checked the doors and windows, making sure they were locked, though part of me knew it wouldn't matter if someone decided to break in. I tried to tell myself it was nothing, maybe a hunter or someone passing through, but the feeling of unease grew stronger. The rest of the day was spent checking every corner of the cabin, examining the windows and listening. Every sound outside made me jump. By the time night fell, I was too nervous to sleep properly, pacing the small cabin and checking the stove for heat. The second night was worse. Around midnight, I heard a sound outside, something scratching against the wooden porch. I froze, straining my ears. It was soft at first, then louder, like claws dragging across the boards. I gripped the handle of the axe I had brought for firewood and slowly moved toward the window, peering out into the dark. I saw nothing, but the sound continued intermittently, moving around the cabin. I kept the lantern close and sat near the stove, trying to keep calm. I told myself it was probably an animal, a raccoon, or a bear looking for food. But the more I listened, the more I doubted that. By morning, I was exhausted, my nerves frayed. I decided to hike back down to the road to see if anyone was around, maybe to buy a few supplies and clear my mind. The walk down the ridge was tense. Every snap of a twig and rustle of leaves put me on edge. When I reached the bottom and stepped onto the road, the sense of relief was immediate. I stopped to catch my breath and listen to the normal sounds of the world. Cars passing far away, birds singing. I filled my water bottle at a roadside spring and considered the footprints I had seen. There were no signs of anyone else around, and I debated whether to go back. When I returned to the cabin, I tried to be more careful. I reinforced the doors with a wooden bar I found in the shed behind the cabin. I stacked firewood near the stove, keeping the axe nearby at all times. I spent the afternoon exploring the surrounding area, noting the trees and paths, trying to familiarize myself. The forest was beautiful, with thick moss, ferns, and wildflowers scattered among the trees, but it also felt oppressive, closing in with its height and density. I tried to distract myself with tasks inside the cabin, cleaning, organizing, and preparing food. The third night, the sounds outside escalated. The scratching returned, louder, and this time I could hear footsteps circling the cabin. I didn't dare go outside, but I watched the windows, seeing movement in the shadows. My mind raced with possibilities. Hunters, poachers, someone hiding, maybe even a desperate person lost in the woods. I thought of calling for help, but the phone signal was weak, nearly non-existent. I could barely send a text. I stayed up all night, axe in hand, waiting, listening. The sounds continued intermittently until dawn, and by the time morning came, I felt as though I had aged years in a few hours. By day, I noticed small signs that something, or someone, had been around. Leaves were disturbed near the windows, small twigs broken, faint footprints in the soil near the porch. The feeling of being watched never left me. I realized that the isolation I had wanted now felt like a trap. There was no one to call for help, no neighbors to check on me, no easy way out if things got worse. I made a plan. I would leave the cabin, but I needed to do it safely with a strategy in case whoever or whatever was around tried to stop me. I packed my backpack, taking only essentials, and left a note on the table describing where I had gone, just in case someone found it. I also carried the axe and a small knife. I planned my route carefully, sticking to the ridge where I could see ahead, avoiding dense underbrush where someone could hide. As I stepped outside, I scanned the area, looking for movement. The forest was quiet, too quiet. Every step I took felt loud in the stillness. As I moved along the ridge, I thought I saw a figure in the trees, just a glimpse of movement, but it disappeared as soon as I focused. My heart raced. I quickened my pace, keeping my eyes on the shadows. I kept to the higher ground, where I could see the creek below and the dirt path leading to the road. The footsteps behind me were subtle at first, but after a while, I was sure I could hear someone following. I kept moving, never running, keeping my balance on the uneven ground. When I finally reached the road, relief washed over me. I kept walking along it, hoping to reach a point where I could get a signal. A mile or so down, I finally found a spot where the phone picked up a faint signal. I called the local authorities and explained the situation, though I kept details about the footprints vague, unsure how to describe them. They promised to send someone to check the area. I stayed on the road, keeping my backpack close, waiting until a patrol vehicle arrived. When they reached me, they were surprised I had made it alone from the cabin, explaining that it was a dangerous area known for poachers and trespassers. They inspected the cabin, noting signs that someone had been around recently, but the forest was so thick and vast that they couldn't guarantee anyone would be caught. They advised me never to go back and offered a safe ride to the nearest town. Weeks later, I still thought about the cabin. The forest, the isolation, the sounds at night. It had left a mark on me. I realized that the peace I had wanted came with a price. Isolation in the wrong place at the wrong time could be deadly. I also realized that survival wasn't about courage alone, but preparation, awareness, and the ability to stay calm under pressure. I never returned to that cabin. Instead, I started planning trips differently, always letting someone know where I would be, never venturing too far without a way to call for help, and always trusting my instincts. The experience at the cabin taught me more about fear and survival than I ever expected. I learned to respect the woods, to understand that the silence could hide danger, and that even in a beautiful, quiet place, there could be threats lurking that required vigilance, patience, and careful thought. In the end, I came back from the woods alive, shaken but wiser. I had faced the unknown in its rawest form, without any myth or legend, and survived. And though I carried the memory with me, it became a lesson rather than just a fear. A lesson that real danger is not always obvious, but careful observation and preparation can keep you safe even in the most isolated, terrifying situations. I had planned the trip for months, a chance to escape the constant noise of the city, the endless alerts and emails and human presence pressing in from every side. I needed silence. I needed isolation. The cabin I found was advertised as remote, tucked deep in the mountains, miles from the nearest road and unseen by neighbors for miles. The pictures online had shown a small wooden structure with a sloping roof, a stone chimney, and wide windows overlooking a dense forest. It looked perfect. When I drove up the winding dirt path, dust curling behind my tires, I felt the first flicker of excitement that only solitude can bring. The air was clean, tinged with pine and earth, and the sky stretched wide and empty, the sun sliding low as afternoon moved toward evening. The cabin was exactly as pictured. I parked my car near the small porch, stretched my legs, and felt the strange thrill of being entirely alone. I unloaded my backpack, my supplies, the small stock of canned food, water, firewood, and a heavy-duty flashlight. The cabin smelled faintly of dust and old wood, but it was not unpleasant. There was a small kitchen, a sleeping loft, and a living area dominated by a fireplace with a stack of dry wood nearby. The windows offered a clear view of the surrounding forest, the trees standing close like silent guardians. That first evening, I made a fire in the fireplace. The sound of the logs snapping and crackling, the warmth spreading through the cabin, brought a sense of comfort. I cooked a simple meal, sitting by the fire as the sun disappeared entirely and darkness fell outside. The forest beyond the windows turned black, except where the faint outline of trees caught the last rays of twilight. I felt a rare calm, a rare contentment, until the first sound made me sit up straight. At first, it was almost imperceptible, a faint snapping of twigs far away, like the wind had brushed through a branch. I told myself it was nothing. The wind would make strange sounds in a forest this dense. The fire hissed in the fireplace, smoke curling up the chimney. I tried to relax, but the snapping came again, closer this time, deliberate. I froze and listened. Then came a low rustle through the underbrush, almost like something moving, and my stomach dropped. I told myself I was imagining it. Wildlife is common in these woods. Deer, maybe a coyote. Nothing dangerous. But the sound persisted. Occasionally, I thought I heard footsteps, soft but deliberate, moving around the cabin. My flashlight rested on the table, and I considered taking it outside to investigate, but the rational part of me urged caution. The windows gave a full view of the area immediately surrounding the cabin. There was nothing visible, just black shadows shifting among the trees. I could see the moon breaking through clouds, a silver slice illuminating the forest floor. Still, there was movement, subtle and deliberate, just outside the range of the porch light. I spent the rest of the night tense, sitting by the fire, flashlight in hand. The sounds never fully went away. Twigs snapping, the rustle of leaves, faint thumps against the cabin walls. I kept convincing myself it was wildlife, but the pattern felt wrong. The animals did not move in organized, almost rhythmic ways. They did not pause, watch, and wait. I tried to sleep in the loft above the cabin, the thin mattress making every movement echo, but I barely closed my eyes. Every sound from below made my heart jump. Morning brought no relief. I woke before dawn, exhaustion making my head pound. The fire had burned down to embers, and I struggled to get it going again. I stepped outside to collect more firewood, noticing the forest looked different in the daylight. Shadows were gone, revealing the dense tangle of undergrowth, fallen trees, and uneven ground. Nothing seemed unusual at first. The air was still quiet, save for the distant caw of a raven or the occasional scurrying of a small animal. I carried a bundle of wood back to the cabin and stacked it neatly, trying to convince myself I was being irrational. Breakfast was simple: canned beans, coffee from instant powder. I sat at the table staring out the window. That was when I noticed something that made my stomach twist. Near the edge of the clearing, where the trees met the open ground, I could see footprints. Large, heavy, and not like anything I had seen in the area before. They weren't deer or bear tracks. They were human. My heart rate spiked. The prints led toward the cabin but ended abruptly at the edge of the clearing. It was impossible to tell if the person had turned back or had hidden. I spent the day reinforcing the cabin as best I could. I checked all the locks, stacked furniture against doors, and made sure windows were shut tightly. Still, I could not shake the feeling of being watched. Every time I stepped outside, I scanned the tree line, looking for the slightest movement. Nothing concrete appeared, but the impression of eyes following me never left. When evening came, I lit the fire again, keeping my flashlight close. The night was worse than the first. The sounds of the forest were alive with motion. Branches snapping, leaves rustling, and what I thought I heard as whispers, low and carried by the wind, or so I tried to convince myself. But there was a pattern, a deliberate presence circling the cabin. I stayed in the living area, not daring to go outside. My phone signal was non-existent, and the thought of being trapped with someone unknown outside was terrifying. The fire provided some comfort, a small barrier against the darkness, but it was fragile. I decided I needed to plan a way to leave, but the road was miles away, twisting and uneven. Driving in darkness was dangerous, and I had no intention of stumbling into some trap blindly. I took stock of the supplies, water, and food. I had enough for a few more days, maybe, but I knew staying would be unbearable. I could not sleep. I could not relax. I sat by the fire with a hunting knife in hand, listening. The night was long, each hour stretching, the sounds never ceasing. By the third day, I realized the intruder, or whatever it was, had not made any direct attempt to enter the cabin. The fear was in the waiting, in the uncertainty. I began taking shifts, keeping watch, sleeping in brief, light naps, waking at the slightest sound. I scouted the perimeter carefully during daylight, noting that some items I had left outside were moved slightly, suggesting someone had been there while I was inside. The footprints persisted, sometimes closer to the porch, sometimes farther away. I could not tell if it was the same person, multiple people, or just my imagination intensifying each sound. I also noticed something else. Small markers in the forest, twigs arranged in unusual patterns, scratches on trees that had not been there before. Someone was signaling, tracking, watching. The reality of the situation sank in. I was being observed, and the person or people were patient. They were letting me feel the fear, building tension, testing me. I felt small and exposed, alone in a place meant for solitude but turned into a trap. The fourth night, I made the decision to leave. I prepared a bag with essentials: water, food, first aid, flashlight, knife, and my phone, even if the signal was weak. I waited until the moon was high, giving some visibility, but not so bright as to expose me fully. I checked all doors, windows, and locks one last time, then left through a side door, staying close to the shadows. My plan was to move quickly to a point where I might get a signal, perhaps a higher elevation, and call for help. The forest was oppressive at night. Every sound was magnified. My own footsteps crunching on leaves, twigs snapping underfoot, the distant howl of an animal. I kept low, moving through undergrowth, the backpack pressing against me. Every rustle made me freeze. Every shadow made me flinch. I kept circling toward the edge of the clearing, hoping the footprints I had seen would not lead to me. Then I saw movement ahead, between two trees, a figure partially obscured by darkness. I froze, holding my breath. The person did not move, just watched. Panic surged through me. I crouched lower, edging sideways, trying to find cover. The figure remained still. I realized then that the person had been tracking me, waiting for me to leave the cabin. My heart pounded so hard it hurt, and every rational thought seemed to flee. Survival instinct kicked in. I ran, blindly, crashing through branches, sliding down small embankments, driven by pure fear. After what felt like hours but could have been minutes, I reached a ridge where I could see the outline of the dirt road I had driven in on. My legs were scraped, bleeding, muscles screaming, but I did not stop. I finally climbed onto the road, screaming, waving my flashlight in the air, hoping someone, anyone, might see me. I kept moving along the road, the car still parked several miles back, but I did not care. Eventually, I reached a bend where a distant light flickered, likely another cabin or small settlement. I ran toward it, hollering, tears streaming down my face. When I reached that cabin, I was met by a man who had seen my flashlight from a distance. He called the authorities for me. The police arrived, taking statements, checking the forest for signs of anyone near my cabin. They found footprints and other subtle signs of someone being in the area, but nothing concrete. There was no one in sight. I realized then that the person had either fled or had been watching from a great distance. The aftermath was unsettling. I could not return to the cabin, could not face the solitude that had once seemed so inviting. Months later, I still feel the fear in quiet moments, remember the sound of snapping twigs, the feeling of eyes on me, the oppressive darkness of the forest at night. But I survived. I made it back to civilization, to safety. I kept every small scar as a reminder, every minor injury as proof of endurance. I learned that the wilderness is not inherently safe, that isolation can be dangerous in ways one cannot always predict. I never went back to the cabin, never even drove near the road leading to it. But I kept a map of the area, a mental record of where the forest was densest, where the terrain could hide someone patient enough to stalk. I bought a small cabin much closer to a town afterward, one where help was minutes away, not miles of darkness. The experience left me with a respect for nature, a knowledge of my own vulnerability, and a constant awareness of the fragility of solitude. And even now, years later, when I sit by my own fireplace, I sometimes think of those nights. The way the shadows moved, the way the sounds followed me, and the eerie patience of someone, or something, waiting unseen. I know the fear I felt then is a shadow that never leaves entirely. But I also know I survived, and there is clarity in that, a sense of triumph over something far greater than myself, something silent, patient, and unrelenting. I had been looking forward to this trip for months, ever since I first stumbled across the small cabin hidden deep in the woods online. It was tucked away in the northern mountains, far from any town, any road, any noise. The pictures online made it look perfect. A wooden cabin with a small porch, a fireplace, and a lake not far from the back. I imagined a quiet week away from emails, phones, and people. Just me, nature, and a little solitude. I drove for hours, my car rattling on the uneven roads, surrounded by tall pine trees that stretched like green walls, blocking out the sun in patches. The air smelled sharp and clean, cold for late September, and the sky was a pale gray, heavy with clouds that hinted at rain. When I arrived, the cabin looked exactly as the photos had promised. Maybe even smaller than I expected, more isolated, and the emptiness around it made the place feel fragile in the wild. There was no other sign of civilization. I parked on the narrow dirt path and unpacked slowly, not rushing, breathing in the quiet. The first thing I noticed was how still it was. No birds, no rustling animals, no wind. Just a kind of tense silence that made me feel both calm and uneasy at the same time. Inside, the cabin smelled of old wood and damp earth. The floors were creaky, and the fireplace had ashes from someone long gone. The furniture was sparse. A small table, a few chairs, a bed with a thin mattress, and a tiny kitchen area with a gas stove. The windows were thin and old, with some cracks in the glass, letting in small whispers of the cold wind. I decided to unpack and make the place feel mine for the week. I set my backpack on the floor, arranged my few supplies, and lit the fireplace. The flames crackled and warmed the room, filling the cabin with a golden, flickering glow that made the shadows dance along the walls. I spent the first afternoon exploring the area around the cabin. There was a narrow trail leading down to the lake, a shallow shore with jagged stones, and trees that rose straight up, blocking the horizon. It was beautiful, almost painfully so, but there was a subtle unease I couldn't shake. It wasn't fear yet, but more of a nervous awareness. I told myself it was normal to feel that way in such complete isolation. That night, the wind picked up. I was lying in the bed, staring at the wooden ceiling, the fire having died down to glowing embers. I could hear it outside, whistling and rattling against the cabin walls. Something in the way it moved through the trees sounded almost like footsteps, slow and heavy, shifting branches. I tried to convince myself it was just the wind, but my stomach tightened anyway. I didn't sleep well that night. Every sound outside seemed amplified: the scrape of branches, the occasional thump of something large moving against the forest floor. In the morning, I decided to make myself busy. I went to gather firewood, chopping and stacking logs, carrying them back to the cabin. The forest around me was dense and quiet. Every now and then, I would hear a distant snapping sound, like something breaking a branch under weight, and I would pause, scanning the trees. There was no one there, but the sound made my heart race. I spent the next day cleaning the cabin and organizing supplies, trying to push the unease aside. I reminded myself that no one else lived out here, that the sounds were natural, that isolation magnifies everything. But as the day went on, the feeling didn't go away. It grew heavier, like the silence itself was pressing in on me. When I stepped outside to check the trail, I noticed the footprints. Small, human-sized footprints leading to the cabin from the edge of the trees, partially obscured by leaves. I froze. They didn't look fresh, but they weren't old either. I hadn't seen anyone else. I hadn't left the cabin unattended. My stomach knotted. I walked back quickly, locking the door, checking the windows. The locks were old, creaky, but functional. I felt safer inside, though only slightly. That evening, the wind returned, stronger than before. I had dinner by the dying fire, trying to focus on a book, but the shadows in the corners of the room seemed sharper. The wooden floorboards groaned under their own weight, or maybe under something else. I told myself it was the house settling, but every creak made me tense, every drafty whistle of wind a warning. I slept poorly again, waking multiple times to check the windows and the door. At some point, I thought I saw movement outside the window near the lake, just a blur, and my pulse shot up. I stayed up for hours watching the dark, waiting. The next day, I decided to explore the lake area. It was a short walk down the narrow trail, but I took my backpack with water, snacks, and a pocket knife just in case. The lake was calm, the water reflecting the gray sky. I walked along the shore, scanning the edges where the forest met the water. That's when I noticed more footprints, some fresh, heading from the woods toward the cabin. They were not mine, and they were recent. Fear gripped me, icy and heavy. I followed them cautiously, keeping low behind trees, trying not to be seen. They led to a narrow part of the trail where the underbrush was thick, then disappeared. Whoever had made them had turned off somewhere, but the proximity to the cabin made it clear they had been near it recently. I rushed back to the cabin and began securing it as best as I could. I moved furniture to block doors, made improvised alarms with cans and string, and kept the knife close. I didn't leave the cabin that night. I stayed by the fire, flashlight in hand, scanning the dark outside. The wind died down, leaving an almost suffocating quiet. The forest seemed to hold its breath. Then I heard it, the faintest sound of snapping twigs very close, just beyond the edge of the tree line. My heart froze. Whoever it was, they were close and they were patient, waiting. I gripped the knife tighter, my knuckles white, eyes wide in the dark. Hours passed. The sound never came closer, never left, but it persisted, a whisper of movement in the dark. Morning came slowly. I could hardly eat, hardly sleep. I debated leaving, but the road was miles away, and without a clear day and map, it would be dangerous. I decided to keep watch, moving from window to window, scanning for any sign of the intruder. That day I heard voices, faint and distorted, carried on the wind from somewhere deep in the forest, though I knew no one should be there. I stayed in the cabin, moving cautiously, keeping all doors locked. By evening, I realized the intruder wasn't going away. They had been here, circling, watching. The thought alone made me realize how vulnerable I was. That night, I stayed awake in the loft, flashlight on, knife ready. I could hear the forest alive outside, full of movement, even without wind. At one point, I saw a shadow pass the window near the porch. My breath caught. I stayed perfectly still, pretending to sleep, my heart hammering. The shadow lingered, then moved away slowly. I didn't sleep until dawn, staring at the small fireplace embers, unable to shake the sense of being hunted. I knew I had to leave. I packed quickly, quietly, making sure the intruder wouldn't know I was leaving. I waited for morning when the forest would be more visible and the intruder might still be asleep or gone. By 7 a.m., I had my car ready and started down the trail cautiously. I kept my eyes on the trees, scanning for movement, but saw nothing. The trail was long and uneven, and I moved fast, adrenaline carrying me past roots and rocks until I reached the dirt road. The forest was still behind me, silent, as though nothing had happened. I drove without looking back, the fear in my chest still tight. When I finally reached the main highway, I pulled over to breathe. The fear began to ebb slightly, replaced by exhaustion and relief. I had survived. The cabin had been beautiful but isolated, and that isolation had made it dangerous in a way I hadn't understood until now. I never went back. Months later, I found out through local forums that trespassers and break-ins were common in the area. People would sometimes follow hikers or squat in abandoned cabins. I had been lucky. The fear of being watched, stalked, hunted in the middle of nowhere had been real, and it had been close. The experience left me cautious. I no longer seek remote cabins without research, without warning someone of my plans. The forest is beautiful, but in that beauty there is a raw, indifferent danger. Humans can be as threatening as the wilderness itself. I still remember the sound of those footsteps outside my window, the faint movements just beyond the trees, and I know how quickly solitude can become vulnerability. I had been planning the trip for months. The cabin was advertised as remote, isolated, and surrounded by nothing but dense forest. It promised peace and a chance to disconnect from the noise of the city, from the constant hum of people and traffic and technology. I was tired in a way that sleep alone couldn't fix, and I thought a few days alone, cut off from everything, would be the reset I needed. When I drove through the winding roads that led to the cabin, the air grew colder and the trees thicker. The sunlight struggled to reach the forest floor, and the shadows felt heavier than they should have. Even though it was midday, the forest seemed to hold its breath. The cabin itself was small, wooden, and looked as though it had been built decades ago. The wood was weathered, some of the planks warped and darkened with age. Moss clung to the roof in uneven patches, and the steps leading up to the porch creaked dangerously under the weight of my bag. Inside, it smelled of damp wood and old pine. Dust lay on every surface, thick enough to see my footprints when I walked through the rooms. The furniture was sparse, functional, but covered in the kind of filmy residue that comes from being rarely disturbed. A single bed with a thin mattress, a small kitchen area with a wood stove, a table, and a chair. There were no modern conveniences here. No electricity, no internet, no running water beyond a small faucet over a sink that looked like it hadn't been used in years. I had brought supplies, enough food and water to last for several days, and I was careful to pack a first aid kit, flashlights, and extra batteries. I had also brought a small gas-powered generator just in case. The instructions for the cabin emphasized safety. Keep the generator outside, store water carefully, avoid leaving food out. The owner mentioned the wildlife in passing, a casual note about bears and the occasional mountain lion, but I dismissed it. I had been camping before. I had spent nights alone in the wilderness. I thought I knew what caution looked like. The first evening passed quietly. I chopped some firewood and started a fire in the small fireplace. I boiled water, ate some canned food, and watched the flames dance across the dark wood of the cabin's interior. The forest outside was alive with sound, but none of it felt threatening. Birds settling down for the night, the rustle of leaves in the wind, an occasional snapping branch somewhere far off. I felt at peace. For the first time in months, my mind quieted, and I slept well, even as the wind creaked against the cabin's frame. The second day, I decided to explore the surrounding area. The cabin sat near a trail that cut through the dense forest, though the path was faint and overgrown in places. I walked for hours, following the trail as it twisted and turned between thick trees, over rocks and past shallow streams. The isolation was absolute. Not once did I see another person. I took care to mark my route, breaking small sticks in unique ways and arranging rocks as subtle markers, because I did not trust myself to remember the path perfectly. By late afternoon, I returned to the cabin exhausted but content. I tended to the fire, cooked another small meal, and sat quietly as the night settled in again. It was the third day that the first signs appeared. Started small, a subtle feeling like the forest outside was different. The wind had shifted. It carried smells I did not recognize, faint but pungent. The trees that had seemed benign the day before now pressed closer, shadows stretching across the cabin windows in unnatural ways. The silence was heavier, punctuated by noises that did not make sense. In the distance, I heard a branch snap sharply. At first, I assumed it was an animal, a deer perhaps, but it was too deliberate, too forceful. I checked the perimeter of the cabin, circling slowly, looking for signs of larger wildlife. There was nothing, no tracks, no prints in the damp soil, nothing. Yet the feeling persisted. Something was watching. My rational mind tried to explain it away. Fear plays tricks. The forest is full of sounds that can confuse the senses. But the pit in my stomach would not leave, and I noticed that even the birds were silent now. Not a single chirp or rustle from the treetops. That night, I barely slept. Every creak of the cabin made me tense. Every shadow across the wall felt like movement. I found myself sitting upright for hours, listening. Around 2 in the morning, I heard it. A deliberate step outside, slow and heavy, pausing, then moving again. My heart raced. I did not make a sound. I held my breath, straining to hear, straining to see through the darkness outside the small windows. The sound stopped suddenly, as though whoever or whatever it was had vanished. I checked all the doors and windows. They were locked, secured with latches I had verified dozens of times before. The feeling of being watched did not subside. It intensified. Every noise outside seemed deliberate, every rustle of the trees calculated. I tried to tell myself it was an animal. I tried to rationalize it as imagination heightened by isolation. But then I noticed it. Small scratches along the outer frame of the cabin door, fine marks in the wood that had not been there before. I spent the next day in a fog of caution. I avoided the trail and stayed close to the cabin, moving slowly, checking every corner, every window, every shadow. My food and water were intact, my supplies untouched, but I could not shake the awareness that something had been near me during the night. The forest had shifted from being a quiet refuge to a cage of invisible eyes. On the 4th day, things escalated. It was late afternoon when I heard the sound again. Not just footsteps, but multiple, slow, deliberate circling the cabin. The noise of breaking twigs and scraping branches surrounded me, punctuated by heavy thuds, almost like someone testing the cabin's doors. My first reaction was to arm myself. I had a hunting knife, a small axe, and a flare gun. I secured myself in the cabin, locking every door and barring the windows with furniture I could push around. Hours passed, and the sounds continued intermittently, sometimes close, sometimes retreating into the forest. I did not leave. I stayed crouched in the shadows near the fireplace, listening to the wind and the movement outside. The fear was raw, primal. I realized that I was no longer just afraid of being alone in the forest. I was afraid of another human presence. Someone watching, someone who had planned this, someone who could move unseen through the trees and remain hidden. The thought that a stranger could be this close, and that I was completely at their mercy, was unbearable. By nightfall, the sounds receded. Exhausted, I slept fitfully, waking every few minutes at the slightest sound. Morning came with rain, heavy and constant, which at least masked any sounds from outside. I spent the day quietly, keeping low, rationing my food and water, and double-checking the locks and windows repeatedly. I knew I could not stay here much longer. I had no idea if whoever had been outside would return, but I did not want to find out. On the 5th day, I decided to leave. I had kept a map and a compass, and though the trail was overgrown, I had marked my way carefully on the first day. I packed as lightly as possible, taking just enough supplies to make it to the nearest road where I could flag down a car. I waited for dawn, the rain having stopped overnight, and slipped out quietly, keeping my back to the cabin as I followed the markers I had made. The walk was grueling. The forest seemed to close in with every step, every shadow moving in ways I could not explain. The branches scraped my clothes and skin, and my eyes were constantly scanning for movement. Every sound made me freeze. I saw footprints in the mud at one point, larger than mine, human, moving parallel to my route but too irregular to track clearly. My stomach churned. Someone had followed me, but whether they had returned to the cabin or were simply watching from a distance, I could not tell. I moved faster, running at times, forcing myself to keep silent. Took hours, but eventually I saw the road. A small, narrow road cutting through the forest, wet and deserted, but a road nonetheless. I ran to it and flagged down the first car I saw. The driver looked confused but stopped. I barely managed to speak, gasping out directions to the nearest gas station and town. I did not look back. The relief of leaving the forest was immense, almost overwhelming. Later, I returned to the cabin with law enforcement. The police found no one, but the scratches on the door, broken twigs, and disturbed underbrush confirmed that someone had been near the cabin. They could not identify who or why. My cabin, which had seemed like a perfect escape, had been a trap, and I realized how close I had come to a situation I could not have controlled. In the weeks that followed, I processed what had happened. I realized that isolation can be dangerous, not because of supernatural forces or imaginary fears, but because it exposes you to realities that are otherwise hidden. Humans can be unpredictable, and in a remote area, the balance between safety and vulnerability can shift in a heartbeat. I never went back. I kept to populated areas, avoided abandoned places, and always remembered the fear, the helplessness, and the constant awareness that someone had been there, watching, circling, and waiting. The experience taught me to respect isolation, to prepare for the unseen dangers of the real world, and to understand that fear is sometimes not a creation of the mind, but a warning of reality. The cabin remains empty now. The owner has kept it on the rental list, claiming it is peaceful and secluded. I know better. I know the darkness can hide more than trees. I know the silence can carry footsteps. And I know that sometimes, when the forest seems calm, it is only holding its breath, waiting for someone foolish enough to step inside. I had been planning this trip for months. The idea of spending a week alone in a cabin deep in the forest had been my way to escape the city, the noise, and the constant rush that never seemed to stop. I had always liked being alone, and I thought that this week would be perfect to clear my head and maybe get some work done on my writing. The cabin I rented was small, old, but sturdy, located in the middle of a dense forest, far from any road that wasn't a rough dirt trail. I packed everything I would need: food, water, a small wood stove for heating, batteries, flashlights, a first aid kit, and my laptop. I thought I was prepared for anything. I was not. The drive to the cabin was long and winding. The road became dirt halfway through, then narrower and overgrown. I remember feeling a little anxious as I drove, noticing how the trees seemed to crowd in closer, almost as if they were watching. I shook the thought off. It was just my imagination. By late afternoon, I finally reached the small clearing where the cabin sat. It looked even smaller than the pictures online, and the paint on the wooden walls was chipped and gray. The windows were dusty, and the roof had patches that looked like they might leak. Still, it was isolated, which was exactly what I wanted. I parked my car, grabbed my bags, and walked up to the cabin. The lock was old and rusty, but it worked. The inside smelled of dust and damp wood. There were a few pieces of furniture. A small table, a couple of chairs, a bed with a thin mattress, and a wood stove. The cabin was cold. The sun was already low, and the forest blocked most of its warmth. I lit a fire in the stove and unpacked my things. I had brought cans of food, some dry pasta, bread, and some snacks. I wanted to make myself comfortable, so I stacked my supplies neatly on the counter and set my laptop on the table, planning to work later that evening. The first night was quiet. The forest made noises that were new to me. Twigs snapping, leaves rustling, the distant calls of birds, or maybe some other animals. I was awake for a while, listening to every sound, trying to figure out what was natural and what might be dangerous. I convinced myself it was just wildlife. Around midnight, I finally fell asleep, the fire having burned down to embers. The next morning, I woke to the sound of birds and the sunlight streaming in through the dirty windows. I made coffee on a small portable stove I had brought and looked out the window. The forest was thick, the trees tall and close together. I noticed for the first time how quiet it actually was. There were no sounds of cars, no distant voices, not even wind. The silence was almost unnatural. I brushed it off as being in a remote area and decided to take a short walk to stretch my legs. I stayed on a narrow trail that led away from the cabin, careful not to go too far. The forest floor was soft with moss and fallen leaves. As I walked, I thought about how peaceful it was. Then I heard a sound that made my stomach twist, the faint cracking of wood behind me. I froze. I told myself it was probably a branch falling, but my eyes scanned the trees nervously. I turned and looked in every direction but saw nothing. Still, I felt like I wasn't alone. The feeling didn't go away as I walked back to the cabin. By the second night, I had already started to feel isolated. I had brought a lot of supplies, but the feeling of being alone in such a dense forest was overwhelming. I was careful with the fire in the stove, making sure it burned steadily, because the cabin had no electricity and it got cold quickly. I tried to distract myself by writing on my laptop, but every few minutes, I would stop and listen. The forest seemed louder at night. Every small noise made me jump. Around midnight, I heard a low thump, like someone or something had hit the cabin wall. I froze, staring at the shadows the fire cast. My heart raced. I told myself again it was probably an animal, maybe a deer or a raccoon, but the sound had been too deliberate. Over the next few days, I started noticing other things. Small signs that someone or something had been near the cabin. Footprints in the dirt outside, not animal prints, but human-sized. Sometimes I would see marks on the trees, scratches that weren't there before. I checked the lock on the door obsessively. I had brought a knife, and I started keeping it on the table next to my laptop at night. I told myself I was just being cautious, that people who rented cabins in remote areas sometimes had trouble with vandals. But the unease grew. On the fourth night, it happened. I had gone to bed early, hoping to get a full night's sleep. Around 2 in the morning, I woke to a sound at the door. Slow, deliberate tapping, like someone trying to get my attention. My heart stopped. I didn't move. I listened, frozen, the knife in my hand. The tapping continued for a few minutes, then stopped. I waited, holding my breath. I thought about calling the police, but there was no signal on my phone, not even one bar. I couldn't leave. The trail to the road was too long to navigate in the dark. I stayed awake the rest of the night, listening. The forest was silent now, but the memory of the tapping kept me alert. When morning came, I cautiously opened the door to check outside. Footprints led up to the cabin, but there was no one there. Something small was left on the porch. A rock with a note scratched into it, saying something I couldn't quite read at first. It was a name. My name. I felt my stomach drop. Whoever it was knew I was here. This was no longer just a remote cabin. It was a trap. I spent the next day preparing. I reinforced the door with a heavy chair and a log from the firewood pile. I packed supplies into my backpack, planning to hike out as soon as it got dark. I couldn't risk being caught outside during the day. I waited until evening, hoping whoever had been watching would leave, but I didn't hear a sound. I decided I had no choice. I needed to get to the road. I left the cabin just after sunset, keeping close to the shadows, listening for anything moving. The trail was narrow and overgrown, and I stumbled several times over roots and rocks. Every sound made me panic. At one point, I thought I saw someone in the trees, watching me. I froze, heart hammering, but when I looked again, there was nothing. I kept moving, faster now, adrenaline pushing me forward. Hours passed. The forest seemed endless, the darkness absolute. I had a flashlight, but it didn't illuminate more than a few feet. I kept checking behind me, terrified someone was following. My legs were sore, my lungs burning, but I didn't stop. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, I saw the faint glow of a car's headlights in the distance. Relief flooded me. I ran toward it, calling out, hoping someone would see me. The car stopped. The driver, an older man, looked confused but let me in. I couldn't speak at first, just shaking, exhausted, terrified. I explained the situation as best I could. He nodded and called the police, who came quickly. They went back to the cabin and found signs of someone hiding nearby. Broken branches, footprints, discarded food wrappers. It wasn't clear how long the person had been watching me, but it was obvious I had been in serious danger. The cabin was cleared, but I didn't go back. I left everything behind, taking only my essentials. In the following days, I stayed with friends while the police investigated. The sense of fear lingered, but I felt a new sense of caution. I realized that isolation could be dangerous, and even a remote cabin in the woods was not completely safe. I never went back to that cabin, and I always checked the location carefully before going to any remote place. What I learned in those terrifying nights in the forest stayed with me. The forest is beautiful, but it can hide dangers that are very real, and sometimes the scariest things are not supernatural, they are human. It started as a trip I had been planning for months. The kind of trip where you imagine the peace of the woods, the quiet that makes every small sound feel sharper, and the feeling that nothing in the world matters except the present moment. I had picked a cabin far away from any town, deep in a forest that was dense and old. The directions I had were vague, just coordinates and a small note from the rental site warning that cell service would be unreliable. That alone excited me. I wanted to escape. I wanted to be alone. The drive itself was long, and the roads became smaller and rougher the closer I got. What had started as a paved highway soon turned into gravel, then into a narrow dirt path lined by trees that were so thick their branches interlocked overhead. By the time I reached the clearing where the cabin was supposed to be, it was late afternoon, and the sun was just touching the horizon. The cabin came into view slowly, hidden behind a curve in the road. It was a small wooden structure, more weathered than the pictures online had suggested. The wood was dark, worn by years of weather, and the roof sagged slightly in the middle. It was simple, with a small porch and a single chimney. There was no electricity, only a small solar panel on the roof and a rainwater collection system outside. I parked my car on the edge of the clearing and stepped out. The air was sharp and clean, scented with pine and wet earth. I carried my backpack to the porch, feeling the weight of anticipation pressing against my chest. The front door was unlocked, and it creaked loudly as I pushed it open. Inside, the cabin smelled of old wood and faint mildew. There were basic furnishings: a small table, a chair, a stove, and a bed pushed into the corner. The windows were dusty, letting in dim strips of light that barely lit the interior. I dropped my backpack near the bed, took a deep breath, and tried to shake off the strange feeling that had started in my stomach as soon as I stepped out of the car. I spent the next hour exploring the cabin. I checked the wood stove, found a small stack of firewood, inspected the water filter system, and even walked around the perimeter to look for a cellar or shed. Everything seemed in order. There was a sense of isolation that was heavier than I expected. The forest was quiet, but not silent. I could hear birds in the distance, the wind through the trees, and somewhere far off, the sound of running water. The trees were close enough that I couldn't see the sky clearly, and the darkness was beginning to stretch across the forest like a curtain. I decided to make a fire. I had brought matches and kindling, and after some effort, I managed to get a small flame going. The fire crackled and spit little sparks, throwing orange light across the walls of the cabin. I felt slightly safer with it, even though I knew the fire would not stop anything if something truly bad happened. After heating up a simple meal for my pack, I sat near the fire and watched it flicker. The quiet around me felt alive, almost like the forest itself was waiting. I reminded myself that this was exactly why I had come, to feel alone, to feel small in a huge, indifferent world. Night fell fully, and with it, the forest transformed. The shadows outside the windows deepened until the trees were only shapes, and the noises of the forest became sharper. Every crack of a branch, every rustle in the underbrush, sounded as if it was right next to the cabin. I realized I had underestimated just how exposed I would feel. I checked the locks on the doors and windows, even though they were just old latches, and then I sat back down by the fire, trying to calm my mind. Around midnight, I woke to a sound I had not expected. At first, it was faint, almost like a whisper, but there was no one to whisper. It was the sound of something scraping against the cabin walls. I froze, straining to hear. The sound stopped, then started again, slightly louder. I moved closer to the door and tried to peer out into the darkness. The moonlight was weak, and the trees blocked most of it. I couldn't see anything, but the scratching continued intermittently, as if whatever it was circling the cabin. My heart rate increased. I considered calling someone, but there was no signal. I considered leaving immediately, but the dirt road out of the forest was narrow and winding, and I had no flashlight yet for a proper trek in the dark. I tried to rationalize it. Animals could make noises like that. Deer sometimes brush against walls. Maybe a raccoon or a bear was investigating. But the sound was deliberate in a way that didn't feel right. It moved from one side of the cabin to the other, slow and measured, stopping when I stopped moving. I remembered the instructions from the rental site. The cabin was in a remote area, and while wildlife was common, bears had been known to come close sometimes. I grabbed a heavy stick from the corner of the room, my mind racing. The scratching became louder, and then a heavy thump shook the cabin wall. I jumped back, my heart hammering, and for a moment I considered just hiding under the bed. Then I remembered the fire. I bolted to the stove, grabbed a burning log, and held it like a torch. The heat and light made me feel more secure, even if it was only psychological. I moved slowly toward the window, peering out. My eyes adjusted to the dark. Nothing, just the dark shapes of the trees. The scratching and thumping had stopped. I tried to calm myself, telling myself it was probably a bear. If it was, it would likely leave once it realized there was no food inside. I resolved to wait it out until morning. I kept the fire alive, sitting as close to it as I could without burning myself, listening to the forest. Hours passed, and the noises didn't return. My mind slowly started to ease. By the time the first light of dawn touched the treetops, I was exhausted but alive. In the morning, I decided to investigate the outside of the cabin carefully. As I walked around, I saw signs that made my stomach tighten. Large footprints pressed into the soft dirt, claw marks on the siding of the cabin, and tufts of fur caught on the wooden walls. It had been a bear, a large one, possibly hungry and possibly territorial. I had survived the night by luck and by keeping calm. I spent the next day reinforcing the cabin as best I could. I piled logs against the weaker parts of the walls, tied extra rope around the doors, and made sure the firewood was safely stored away from the cabin. Every sound outside made me jump, but I forced myself to move carefully, slowly, and deliberately. I also prepared for the possibility that I might need to leave quickly. I found the brightest flashlight in my pack, checked the car, and made sure the keys were in my pocket at all times. The second night was tense but uneventful. I kept a fire going and stayed awake in shifts, moving from one window to another to keep watch. I could hear bears in the distance, sniffing, walking, and occasionally roaring, but none came close. I realized that my fear had been both rational and exaggerated. The bear had tested the cabin, but it wasn't relentless. By the third day, I had regained a measure of confidence. I went for short walks, staying close to the cabin. I found a small stream nearby with clear, cold water and collected some to boil. I gathered berries, though cautiously, knowing that some were likely unsafe. The forest had transformed in my perception from something hostile to something alive and majestic. Every sound was still noticeable, but I could interpret it rather than panic at it. When I left, I felt a mixture of relief and pride. I had survived a night alone, confronted the reality of a wild animal close enough to threaten me, and had maintained calm and rational thought throughout. The drive back on the rough dirt roads gave me time to reflect. I realized that what had been terrifying wasn't supernatural or mysterious. It was simple, raw, real danger, and facing it, preparing for it, and respecting it had changed the way I understood both fear and resilience. By the time I returned to town, I was exhausted, sunburned from the reflection off the snow that had still lingered in shaded areas, and filled with stories I would carry silently for the rest of my life. Not ghost stories, not fairy tales, just the real, tangible reminder of how fragile and yet how capable we can be when we confront the natural world honestly. The cabin was behind me, the forest receding in memory, but the lessons of those nights, the quiet, the sharp sounds, the careful observation, stayed. I had survived and I had learned. I had been planning the trip for weeks, meticulously mapping out the remote cabin I had rented deep in the woods. The promise of solitude, fresh air, and a break from city life had drawn me to this place, far away from any neighbors or roads. The cabin was a small, wooden structure tucked into a clearing surrounded by thick pine and birch trees. From the pictures online, it looked peaceful, almost inviting. But nothing in the pictures prepared me for the isolation, the raw, intense quiet that enveloped the place the moment I stepped out of my car. The drive there had been long and winding. The road grew narrower as I approached the forest, eventually turning into a gravel path barely wide enough for a single car. I passed no houses, no other cars, not even signs of people. The further I went, the more the world behind me seemed to disappear. The forest pressed in on both sides, shadows stretching across the road even in the middle of the afternoon. I remember gripping the steering wheel tighter when I realized that if I broke down out here, it could be hours or even a day before anyone passed by. When I finally reached the cabin, the sun was already low, casting a dim orange glow across the clearing. The cabin itself was simple: wooden walls, a small porch and a stone chimney. A few windows reflected the waning light. I parked my car nearby and stepped out, feeling the chill of the evening air, which was colder than I had expected. There was a certain smell in the forest, a mix of damp soil, decaying leaves, and pine sap, sharp and natural. The wind rustled through the trees, carrying a distant, hollow sound that made the hairs on my neck stand up. I spent the first hour unpacking, bringing in supplies and checking the cabin. Everything seemed in order. The floorboards creaked slightly under my feet. The walls smelled faintly of wood and mothballs, and the windows were streaked from what I assumed were years of rain and dust. The cabin had a fireplace, which I inspected carefully. It was filled with dry logs stacked neatly, ready for a fire. I felt a mix of comfort and unease. The place was undeniably beautiful, but there was something in the air that made me constantly aware of how alone I was. That night, after a simple dinner of canned beans and bread, I started a fire in the fireplace. I sat close, letting the warmth seep into my bones. Outside, the wind grew louder, whipping through the trees and rattling the cabin. I could hear branches creaking and snapping, falling somewhere in the dark distance. Every sound seemed amplified, and I found myself listening more intently than usual. It was not a fear born of imagination yet, but an acute awareness of the wilderness. Around midnight, I noticed something strange. The wind had died down, leaving a still, heavy silence that felt almost unnatural. I was used to the soft, nocturnal sounds of the forest, the rustle of small animals, the distant calls of owls. But now it was dead quiet. My mind began racing. I rationalized it. Maybe it was a temporary lull, maybe the forest creatures were all asleep. Yet, despite trying to calm myself, I felt a tension building, a gnawing feeling that something was off. Then I heard it, a faint tapping like fingernails or claws against wood, coming from the side of the cabin. I froze. My heart started to pound, each beat reverberating in my chest. I strained my ears, trying to tell if it was coming from outside or somewhere inside the cabin. The noise was irregular, hesitant, as if whatever it was testing the walls. I considered leaving immediately, grabbing my keys and running to the car, but the thought of stumbling into the dark forest alone was just as terrifying. I tried to rationalize. Maybe it was an animal. Raccoons or squirrels were known to chew on wood, but the sound didn't match anything I had heard before. It was deliberate, almost intelligent. I glanced toward the windows, but the darkness outside was impenetrable, the dense trees forming a wall that blocked any view. My mind was a mix of fear and denial. I told myself it was nothing, that the isolation was playing tricks on me. I stayed up the rest of the night in the living room, keeping the fire alive, constantly listening. Every now and then, I would hear the tapping again, always from the same side of the cabin. Sometimes it paused, then resumed. I didn't sleep. The first rays of dawn did little to relieve my tension. The forest looked the same as the pictures, serene and beautiful, but I felt an unease that would not dissipate. Over the next day, I tried to distract myself. I walked the surrounding woods, taking photographs, collecting firewood, and noting the subtle beauty of the forest. I told myself that being on edge was normal when alone in such a remote place. Yet, every time I returned to the cabin, I noticed small changes. A log that had been stacked neatly on the porch would be moved slightly, footprints that weren't mine in the dirt, even though I had cleared everything upon arrival. Each small anomaly made my skin crawl. By the second night, my anxiety had grown considerably. I stayed in the cabin, keeping the doors locked and checking the windows repeatedly. Around 10 o'clock, I noticed shadows moving outside. At first, I thought it was the trees swaying in the wind, but there was no wind. The shadows were deliberate, moving in ways that seemed to circle the cabin. I didn't see a figure clearly, but the feeling of being watched became overwhelming. My senses were heightened, every noise exaggerated. The forest had transformed from a peaceful retreat into an unpredictable and threatening entity. Suddenly, I heard a crash from the back of the cabin. Something had hit the wood with significant force. My pulse jumped, and I could feel my hands trembling. I grabbed a heavy metal flashlight from the shelf and approached the back door cautiously. Peering through the small window, I could see broken branches, and the earth was disturbed, as if someone or something had been digging or moving around. My mind raced. I considered calling the police, but my phone had no signal. Panic started to rise, but I forced myself to think clearly. I remembered seeing a small shed near the edge of the clearing during my walk earlier. Perhaps it was a wild animal that had gotten trapped or caused trouble. I decided to check it. Taking a flashlight and a sturdy stick, I moved slowly toward the shed. The air was cold, biting, and every crackle of leaves underfoot sounded like gunshots in the quiet night. When I reached the shed, the door was slightly ajar. I pushed it open cautiously. Inside, there were old tools, rusted and covered in dust. Nothing moved, no sign of life. Relief washed over me, and I laughed quietly at my own fear. Maybe it had been the wind or a branch falling. I took a deep breath and returned to the cabin. But the feeling of being watched did not leave me. That night, I barely slept, listening to every creak and rustle. At one point, I thought I heard soft footsteps on the porch. I shined my flashlight outside, but again, there was nothing. I began to notice patterns. Things inside the cabin being slightly out of place. Doors that I was sure I had locked left slightly ajar. Scratches on the wooden floor near the back entrance. Whoever or whatever had been around had left a subtle trail of their presence. enough to unsettle me without being fully visible. The next morning, I decided that I could not stay another night. I packed quickly, every movement filled with urgency. But when I reached my car, I discovered something impossible. The keys were missing. I checked the interior, retraced my steps, and searched the surrounding area, but they were gone. My panic surged. I could not leave the cabin, not easily, and the isolation made the situation infinitely worse. I considered walking to the nearest road, but I had no map and the forest was dense and unmarked. I felt trapped, the reality of my vulnerability pressing down on me. As the day passed, I stayed inside, barricading the doors with furniture, keeping a fire going for warmth and light. I scoured the cabin for anything that could be used as a weapon or a tool. I found a hatchet and kept it close. The noises continued, tapping, scratching, the occasional thud against the walls. Every sound sent adrenaline surging through my body, heightening my senses. I ate sparingly, knowing I might need energy if the situation escalated. Late in the afternoon, I noticed fresh footprints in the mud outside, unmistakably human. They circled the cabin, never venturing too far, always returning to the back. My stomach turned. I realized that this was no animal. Someone had been watching me, testing me, keeping track of my movements. The thought was horrifying. I thought about what I would do if they came inside, how I would defend myself. Hours passed, and the sun began to dip low. The forest seemed to close in, shadows stretching long across the clearing. Then, a sudden noise, the crash of a branch breaking near the car. I froze, gripping the hatchet, staring through the window. Movement. I saw a figure, partially obscured by trees, moving quickly but cautiously. My heart pounded, my body tense with fear. I remembered the spare keys I had hidden in my backpack inside the cabin. With deliberate care, I waited for the figure to turn away, then sprinted to the backpack, grabbed the keys and ran to my car. My pulse was racing, every second stretching into eternity. I got inside, locked the doors and started the engine. The figure was gone. I drove slowly at first, scanning the trees, then faster as adrenaline took over. The gravel road stretched endlessly, but I eventually reached the main road. I did not stop until I reached a gas station in the next town. I was shaking, exhausted, my body tense from the hours of fear and vigilance. Later, after I calmed down, I realized something important. I had survived because I stayed alert, kept track of every detail, and remained cautious without letting panic completely take over. The experience left me shaken, but it also gave me a strange sense of clarity. I understood the value of preparation, awareness, and self-reliance in situations where there was no immediate help. In the days that followed, I returned to my apartment and reported the incident to the local authorities. They investigated and found evidence that someone had indeed been watching the cabin for some time, possibly targeting renters like me. The authorities were never able to identify the person, but the cabin was closed for safety reasons. I never went back. The memory stayed with me, etched vividly. The endless quiet, the shadows, the subtle signs of someone else's presence, and the sharp realization of just how vulnerable I could be when isolated. I eventually moved on, but I never forgot that cabin. It taught me that fear is not always about monsters or ghosts. It is about the reality of being completely alone, at the mercy of the unknown, and having to rely solely on your wits, your instincts, and your courage to survive. And sometimes, that is the scariest thing of all.